Americans to America, we promise to deliver a government that's accountable. Safeguarding our constitutional freedoms and restoring the people's voice were essential components of that promise. The size and scope of government continues to increase, something that President Biden's leadership has only accelerated. And we must do everything we can to ensure that the voices of everyday Americans are not silenced by the very state that was meant to serve them. Recently, we witnessed modern governments abuse their authority and weaponize their financial system against their own citizens. In China, the CCP uses a central bank digital currency to track spending habits and to establish a social credit system intended to further restrict the behavior of the Chinese people. But it isn't just communist regimes. One of our greatest allies has utilized a similar means of financial restriction. In 2022, Justin Trudeau's government in Canada froze individuals' bank accounts for participating in the trucker convoy protests. This appetite for financial surveillance is gaining a stronghold right here at home. Notably, the White House issued Executive Order 14067, urging central bank digital currency research and development. In a corresponding report, the Biden administration doubled down and made it clear that they were willing to trade America's right to financial privacy for a surveillance-style central bank digital currency. This means financial surveillance and domination belong on the pages of a George Orwell novel or a science fiction script. They are wholly not consistent with our shared American values. Congress must act to ensure our constituents' hard-earned money cannot be used to further encroach on their freedoms or to punish them for speaking their minds. H.R. 5403, the Cbdc Anti-Surveillance State Act, would prohibit unelected bureaucrats from issuing a central bank digital currency, denying them a critical building block in this would-be dystopian nightmare. Sadly, that isn't the only effort to stifle America's voices. The left's increased enthusiasm for including illegal immigrants in the elections process threatens to dilute the vote of citizens and their role in determining the course of our democracy. In keeping with House Republicans' concern on this issue, the committee will take into consideration legislation meant to address this misguided trend within Washington, D.C. itself. Specifically, H.R. 192 would prohibit non-citizens from voting in D.C. local elections for public office, including any ballot initiatives or referendum. In taking this measure, Congress is satisfying its constitutional role in relation to the district. Americans deserve to have confidence in our election system and confidence in knowing that only legal American citizens are casting their vote in elections here in this country, especially here in the capital of all places. Finally, the committee will hear testimony on H.R. 4763, the Financial Innovation and Technology for the 21st Century Act. It's past time for Congress to establish a regulatory framework that provides clarity and certainty to the digital assets marketplace. We cannot continue to allow unaccountable bureaucrats to fill this void. H.R. 4763 would set up the framework and offer much-needed regulatory clarity for digital asset ecosystem to thrive in the United States. The bill before us today constitutes a bipartisan solution to this problem and demonstrates regular order and a committee collaboration at its finest. It is a privilege to consider it. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and the opportunity to advance meaningful legislation that keeps the promise to the American people. And I'm now pleased to yield to our ranking member, Mr. McGovern, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we are back in the House Rules Committee this week with more reruns, wasting more time on bills that will never become law and some that have pretty much already been considered by this committee. H.R. 192 is another GOP attempt to meddle in D.C. politics. It is a shame that Republicans aren't putting the same energy and efforts into legislating for their constituents as they are into interfering in local laws here in Washington, D.C. It's astounding to me that the party that claims they care about small government and local government wants to have the federal government tell local leaders here in D.C. how to run their local elections. Apparently, they're all for local control, unless it's local control by Democrats, in which case they're happy to change their tune. And to hear the chairman or hear Republicans talk about the importance of election integrity is particularly rich, coming from the party that continues to provide cover to those who violently attacked this Capitol on January 6th to try to overturn the results of the presidential election that have been affirmed by virtually every single court in this land and by every judge that has considered the case, including Republican judges. I find it particularly rich that my friends are talking about election integrity. But we are also here to consider H.R. 4763, a bill that provides an upper hand to the crypto industry instead of meaningfully addressing gaps in digital asset regulation. Once more, House Republicans are putting billionaires ahead of American consumers. Finally, we will meet on H.R. 5403, a bill that prevents the U.S. from exploring digital currency. I know my friends on the other side are afraid of innovation, but 130 countries representing 98% of global GDP are looking into digital currency. Maybe, just maybe, it's something we should look into as well. Unfortunately, I think some of my friends on the other side want to go back to stone tablets and whale oil. They're trying to roll back the clock on a vast number of things because they are afraid of progress. And again, if their thinking had dominated, I bet we would never have had the internet, probably would never have had telephones, probably never would have had telegraphs or photographs or cameras because everything has privacy concerns. It is our job in Congress to address the privacy concerns, but not bury our heads in the sand and pretend like the world isn't moving forward with or without us. And these measures speak to the broader pattern of this Republican majority. Their agenda is out of touch with the American people. It's all MAGA messaging, stunts instead of solutions. Every chance they get, they pick extremism and messaging bills over bipartisanship and working together. Look at their record. They wasted weeks on kicking out their own speaker. They just tried to do it again this month, and Democrats had to save them. They've lost 7 rule votes since January of 2023. 7. A stunning indictment of their ability to get anything done. And speaking of indictments, they're skipping their day jobs to serve as pathetic props in matching red tie cult uniforms for Donald Trump during his criminal trial, and they're attacking the judge and the courts in a way that I think would outrage traditional conservatives. They have turned this place into a circus. Meanwhile, Democrats want to govern to make life better for the American people. We made sure that the U.S. didn't default on its debt last year. We kept the government open and blocked massive spending cuts that would have hurt working people. We saved Speaker Johnson from Marjorie Taylor Greene's extremism. We negotiated on a bipartisan border security bill before Trump killed it. Democrats are putting people first. It's as simple as that. And Republicans are putting politics first. And they are running one of the most incompetent, ineffective, and embarrassing sessions of Congress, possibly in history, and certainly since I've been here. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman for his remarks. Without objection, any prepared statements our witnesses have will be included in the record. I want to welcome our first panel, Representative French Hill and Ranking Member Maxine Waters from the Committee on Financial Services, and Representative Dusty Johnson from the Committee on Agriculture. Representative Hill, I welcome your testimony.
Chairman Burgess, Ranking Member McGovern, thank you for the opportunity to present the joint work of our 2 committees, the House Agriculture and House Financial Services Committees. Let me start first with H.R. 4763, the Financial Innovation and Technology for the 21st Century Act, or FIT 21. Mr. Johnson and I were pleased to co-author this groundbreaking bill with Agriculture Chair Thompson, along with our colleagues Warren Davidson and Tom Emmer. In the wake of FTX's catastrophic collapse in 2022, Financial Services Committee Chair McHenry, Ag Chair Thompson crafted a set of principles to assure that we needed legislation to protect consumers and establish clear rules of the road, whereby good actors who want to innovate responsibly have that kind of regulatory clarity. Absent clear rules, we will continue to see the SEC pursue a regulation by enforcement agenda that leaves market participants fearing that they'll be subject to litigation at a moment's notice if they continue to operate in the United States. Who does it hurt the most? Our constituents. FIT 21 alleviates this concern by leveraging the existing capabilities of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodity Future Trading Commission. I'm proud to say that this bill is the product of countless bipartisan discussions between members of the House Financial Services and Ag committees. Despite this, some may argue that the SEC's concerns with the legislation should trump our work. Let me be clear. We incorporated a significant amount of feedback from the agencies, including the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as members of Congress and market participants, all during the past 14 months. With FTX collapse fresh in our minds, we wanted to ensure that the United States avoided future fraudulent activity conducted in the same manner as we witnessed in FTX. As such, this bill imposes strict consumer protections that do not allow commingling of customer funds. We included provisions to mitigate conflicts of interest. We impose capital and other necessary requirements on intermediaries, and we impose higher standards for custody. While market participants wait for rules to be finalized, we include an interim oversight process where entities will need to file a notice of intent to register with the SEC and the CFTC, thus subjecting themselves immediately to federal regulatory oversight. Again, my colleague from California, the ranking member, may say that the status quo is preferred and that the SEC has all the authority that it needs. But let's consider what the status quo for a second. We have a $2 trillion industry, with a majority of which is subject to very limited federal oversight. If the existing ad hoc process remains in place, I'm convinced we'll continue to be plagued by future FTX-like situations because consumers are not afforded the careful protections crafted in this proposal. This bill does not create securities loopholes. This bill does not deregulate crypto. Quite the contrary, this framework recognizes the unique characteristics for the evolution of blockchain networks so that consumers can receive similar protections that they have today in traditional financial markets. We accomplished this by creating a fit-for-purpose disclosure regime where investors are regularly provided with material information about a digital asset being overseen by the SEC or the CFTC. Regardless of what some critics claim, this bill does not create a light touch regime for crypto crooks or prevent the SEC from being able to police its markets. We closely emulated the SEC's current registration exemption regime for the offer and sale of certain digital assets. We are not reinventing the wheel. However, we're clarifying why restricted digital assets are unique from traditional securities and should be regulated differently. This follows the principle that we've had from the beginning: same risk, same regulation. This bill also gives the SEC clear authority over restricted digital assets that are not certified under the legislation to be considered as a digital commodity. However, if these digital assets do satisfy the standards set forth in our bill, then those assets would be traded as digital commodities and be under the watch of the CFTC. FIT 21, Mr. Chairman, is a watershed moment for entrepreneurs and innovators, and more broadly, our country. Now let me turn to highlight the importance of Whip Emmer's H.R. 5403, the Cbdc Anti-Surveillance Act. This bill is very simple. It prohibits the Federal Reserve from issuing a Cbdc unless it's open, permissionless, private, and fully preserves the privacy protections of cash. Fortunately, the U.S. Constitution expressly grants Congress the sole authority to coin money and regulate the value thereof. However, vague statements from the Federal Reserve about the legal authority to issue CbdCs necessitate this legislation. We must make it completely clear that authorization must come directly from Congress. Claiming that a Cbdc is needed for faster payments further ignores the private sector innovations. CbdCs put the government in a place where they don't belong. The only benefit that a Cbdc has is increasing surveillance and control over Americans' financial lives, which flies in the face of America's right to privacy. I thank the committee for your time, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks, gentlemen, for his remarks. The chair recognizes the ranking member of the Financial Services Committee, Ms. Waters, for her comments.
Thank you, Chairman Burgess and Ranking Member McGovern, for the opportunity to testify today on H.R. 4763, sponsored by Rep. Thompson, and H.R. 5403, sponsored by Representative Emmer. Let me begin with H.R. 4763, which should be called the Not Fit for Purpose Act. We have seen many efforts by Republicans to weaken safeguards for various industries, but this is perhaps the worst most harmful deregulatory proposal I have seen in a long time. It reminds me of the time that Congress passed the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, or the CFMA, which passed in 2000 in response to intense lobbying by the financial industry, claiming that the bill would provide legal clarity and promote innovation. At that time, the chair of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, Brooksley Bourne, warned that failing to put safeguards around so-called over-the-counter derivatives would cause significant harm. But Congress instead listened to the financial services industry, pressing to ensure there were no rules. And Mr. Chairman, less than a decade later, those same derivatives blew up our economy when AIG collapsed because of its unregulated derivatives exposures. And now Congress is hearing similar arguments about the need to take off the guardrails to crypto. While Mr. Hill focused his remarks on this bill on how it would apply to crypto, I want to be very clear that this bill is not just about crypto. It would affect traditional securities also. Specifically, the bill defines two new asset classes: one, digital commodities, and two, investment contract assets. Crypto that meets the definition of a digital commodity would be able to switch from SEC's purview to a higher touch regime under CFTC. This is highly problematic for several reasons, but I'll just list two. First, Congress never intended the CFTC to become a regulator for financial instruments that are directly or indirectly sold to retail investors. The bill does not remedy this fundamental issue. The bill puts the responsibility to regulate without, for example, providing CFTC general authority to go after fraud, market manipulation, or investor practices similar to the prophetic authorities that the SEC has today. Second, while the bill has some disclosure requirements on issuers of digital assets, these requirements cease 180 days after the digital asset becomes a digital commodity. So even as these products get marketed as CFTC-regulated crypto exchanges, the CFTC would have the authority to require ongoing, fulsome, reliable, and audited financial statements from the issuers, or even information on what the issuers of the digital asset plans to do with the investors' money. What is even more problematic is the bill's definition of, and I quote, investment contract assets. Securities that meet this definition would be transferred into a regulatory void with no primary regulator and virtually no laws and regulations to speak of. Importantly, the definition of investment contract asset is not limited to crypto, and it would be fairly easy for both crypto and traditional securities to be formatted to meet this definition. Moreover, this new category of assets was added after this bill was marked up by the Financial Services Committee and the Agriculture Committee. So this is the first time that we have been able to discuss the impact of these dramatic changes. By stripping the entirety of the securities law framework from this class of assets, this bill would eliminate critical protections for investors, consumers, and the markets built over the past 90 years, including a private right of action, protections against conflicts of interest, disclosure requirements that provide market transparency, enforcement by states, and enforcement by the SEC. Ultimately, the massive loopholes in this bill would degrade investor trust, cause broad market uncertainty, and allow fraud to proliferate resulting in devastating losses for not just crypto consumers, but also for non-crypto investors who are trying to save for retirement, college, or other life goals. By degrading investor trust in our capital markets, this bill would also make it more expensive for businesses, both big and small, to raise capital and ultimately raise the cost of a broad range of goods and services for everyone in America. The SEC is the federal agency on the front lines of enforcing our existing securities laws on crypto firms who willfully chose to ignore the law and that have already defrauded customers out of billions of dollars with a get-rich-quick scheme. Giving this industry a free pass to avoid most or all regulations cannot be the answer to the serious concerns that members have raised about crypto fraud and the prevalent use of crypto by human traffickers and drug traffickers. For all members who are concerned about fentanyl coming into our country and young women and girls being trafficked, I urge you to remember that the preferred currency of these criminals is crypto. I would strongly urge members to oppose this bill. Now, let me pivot to talk about Mr. Emmer's bill, H.R. 5403. This bill prohibits the issuance of any central bank digital currency, or CBDC, by the Federal Reserve. This includes the Federal Reserve's current CBDC pilot projects with U.S. banks and foreign counterparts to facilitate faster and less costly cross-border payments. By prohibiting all CBDCs, the bill threatens the very primacy of the U.S. dollar and the power that affords our nation today. Today, the U.S. dollar is the global reserve currency with more than half of all international trade done in dollars. But the world is looking at how to speed up transactions and reduce costs, including by issuing their own central bank digital currencies. Currently, 135 nations are racing forward with CBDC development, including our G7 peers, which are in far more advanced stages of CBDC development than the U.S. In fact, if this bill becomes law, we would be the only country in the world to ban a CBDC. The dollar's dominance today also makes economic and trade tools like U.S. sanctions to potent, allowing us to leverage access to dollars and U.S. markets as a national security response to adversaries like Russia and Iran. However, our adversaries, notably China and Russia, are developing their own digital currencies to hopefully be an alternative to the dollar, enabling them to undercut our economy and sidestep U.S. sanctions. If this weren't bad enough, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office highlighted an issue committee Democrats raised during markup, which is that the bill's sweeping definition of a CBDC can be interpreted to encompass all of the Federal Reserve's digital liabilities, such as bank reserves. This means that the bill could seriously impair the Fed's monetary policy tools and its ability to combat inflation, and could also disrupt critical Fed systems that facilitate the movement of payments between banks. This appears to be a deliberate backdoor way to advance Trump's agenda to undermine the Fed. It is ironic to say that these two bills are being considered together, one to halt digital asset innovation for government uses, and the other to eliminate all rules for the crypto industry that has a record of ripping off consumers. But what isn't surprising is the opposition these bills have received, including from our state securities regulators, organizations who are concerned about investors and consumers, labor organizations, technologists, environmental groups, and civic organizations. Concerned about good government, I join their opposition to these two bills and urge members to reject H.R. 5403 and H.R. 4763. I would also urge the committee to make all Democratic amendments offered in order, which will go a long way toward mitigating the great harms caused by these bills. And so I'll be happy to answer any questions for you you may have.
I thank the ranking member for her testimony. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Dakota for his comments.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's be clear, the status quo is not working. Now, you do not need to take my word for it. Over the last 18 months, both of these committees have heard from expert after expert on both sides of the aisle that a substantial regulatory gap exists today, and that regulatory gap puts at risk consumers, it is pushing trading volume overseas, and it is stifling innovation. The evidentiary record of both committees is clear on that. Where are we at today? And I think the names of both agencies we've been talking about are illustrative. They're helpful to us as we figure out what role do they play. You have the Securities Exchange Commission. And of course, they regulate securities when you've got an investment contract, when in essence you have an ownership stake in an enterprise. And then you've got the Commodities Future Trading Commission. And what they do is deal with other commodities, things that particularly related to derivatives. And so think about swaps, think about futures for coffee, for oil, for gold. That's what they do. Both of these agencies deal with assets. Now, they deal with them in different ways, and they look at what is the design, what is the function, what is the use of these assets before you decide who the appropriate regulator is. I'll give you one example. Every one of which I'm aware acknowledges that Bitcoin is not a security, and it is not subject to SEC regulation. And in fact, 70% of the digital asset volume today already is not subject to the SEC's jurisdiction because they're not viewed as security transactions. Now, not every digital asset is quite as cut and dried as Bitcoin, and that's where we get the problem. We have, in this gray area, I'll back up. Clearly, the Commodities Exchange Act of 1922 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 did not spell out exactly when is a digital asset a security and when is it not. And so that has created a gray area, and unfortunately in that gray area, the SEC has rushed in with quite aggressive and quite expansive regulatory actions. I would submit to you that it's a pretty bad way to make law by allowing an agency to govern by enforcement letter. We have an Article I duty to lay out the rules of the road. The regulatory gap is clear in our committee's record, and I think it's our job to address that regulatory gap. The combination of SEC overreach, which, by the way, courts have ruled against, and the failure of Congress to speak has created an environment where we are falling behind, ladies and gentlemen. We are the only G10 country that has not addressed these issues, and now is the time for us to act. So I think if you pull back the camera and you say, what does this bill do? I think it does three major things. First off, it does clarify the roles for both the SEC and the CFTC in this space, critically important. Number two, it provides the CFTC the authority to regulate intermediaries in the commodities spot market. That is critically important. And then it establishes decentralization as the key concept determining whether or not a digital asset is a security. And I think that is incredibly important. We're, of course, happy to discuss any of these specifics, but I will close by reflecting a little bit on the remarkable process that has led us here. At the beginning of the 118th Congress, Chairman McHenry and Thompson decided that they were going to, together and in a bipartisan way, address these regulatory gaps. They deputized me and deputized Mr. Hill to play point, and we together, the four of us, established the guidelines that have governed our efforts over the last 18 months. For a year, we collaborated together in what has to be an unprecedented manner, Mr. Chairman, by holding joint hearings, by engaging stakeholders in a joint way, and by hosting bipartisan roundtables where members of both committees were there participating. I would also note it is hard to overstate how helpful commissioners of the CFTC on both sides of the aisle have been in helping us get here. Chair Benham has been remarkable in helping us understand the size and scope of this regulatory gap and pointing out some technical areas that we would want to make sure that we addressed in any legislation. I also want to thank some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for their remarkable contributions. Literally dozens of amendments have been made at various steps along this process to accommodate the intelligent, persistent, and productive engagement by a number of members. Of course, I know the Ag members best. I would tell you Ms. Caraveo has been remarkable, as has Ms. Bazinski, Ms. Glusenkamp-Perez, Ms. Craig, Ms. Crockett have been helpful as well. I know on financial services, Mr. Nichols, Mr. Torres have also been remarkably helpful. This is how Congress is supposed to act, Mr. Chairman. With that, of course, I would stand by for questions.
I thank the gentleman. Thank all of our witnesses. We'll move to questions, and let me just ask him very broadly. I mean, the FTX thing that happened 2 years ago was pretty shocking. Was grateful it didn't get worse than what it was, and we didn't see a replay of 2008 all over again. But how are we positioning ourselves to not be facing that same type of crisis in FTX again?
I'm sure Mr. Hill will enlighten you with more intelligence, so I would just start by noting that I am incredulous, Mr. Chairman, that we have members who allege that the current regulatory environment is just fine. The FTX debacle happened under this current regulatory environment. And what we know is that there are numerous provisions in this bill that would make that kind of debacle far less likely. For instance, we know that the foundational problem with FTX was the commingling of customer funds with their own. That kind of nonsense would not be allowed under FIT 21.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Thank you very much. To your question, let's see, major segments of the crypto industry have continued to fight tooth and nail to operate outside of established financial laws and have intentionally chosen not to register. They've broken the law already with the SEC while making billions of dollars unlawfully issuing or facilitating the buying and selling of crypto securities. One of the things they want this bill to do, in addition to everything else it's doing, is to make sure that they're not held accountable for the laws they have already broken. As a result, millions of investors have lost their hard-earned savings as a result of fraud and abuse at the hands of non-compliant crypto criminals. Other entities like BlockFi, Celsius, Terraform, Labs, and Voyager have also made up countless other crypto failures. The SEC has moved quickly to crack down on this rogue industry, issuing its first crypto-related enforcement action in July 2013 and issuing approximately 170 crypto-related actions since that time. The SEC has launched actions against players like Binance, Coinbase, with charges including failure to register, misleading investors about manipulative trading, and more. Sam Bankman-Fried, the former CEO of XTX, as well as former Binance CEO, CZ, were also sentenced to prison earlier this year. Earlier this year, on February 7, Trade Station agreed to pay $1 million to settle the SEC's action against them for failing to register the offer and sale of a crypto lending product. On January 19, Nexo Capital agreed to pay $22.5 million and cease its unlawful actions for failing to register the offer and sale of crypto assets lending product. According to the SEC's enforcement results for the end of last year, the agency filed 784 enforcement actions, obtained orders for nearly $5 billion in financial remedies, and distributed nearly $1 billion to harmed investors, people who had already been taken advantage of. More recently, on March 14, the SEC took action against 17 individuals for their roles in a $300 million Ponzi scheme involving the company Crypto FX, which targeted more than 40,000 predominantly Latino investors in the United States and 2 other countries. This is the SEC at work, and the efforts we must support. Instead of supporting the SEC's work in cracking down on crypto fraud, this bill would push the SEC off to the sidelines and effectively legitimize fraud by eliminating a variety of protections that are currently in place to prevent and enforce against fraud. And let me just say, Mr. Chairman, when the SEC takes on these cases, they have to go to court. They have to fight against these crypto firms. It takes a lot of work. The FEC really needs even more staff to deal with the criminal fraud of these crypto companies. And so to talk about taking them away from this little agency, CFTC, somehow to provide these guardrails, to do these investigations, to take on these court cases, is absolutely unbelievable that anybody would believe that. And so we are working very hard because we think this bill is very dangerous. Not only is it dangerous because it doesn't have the guardrails, but in the bill, it creates another space where there's no regulation. It is like a no man's land, and they don't have to be in compliance with anybody. It's enough here for the average person, particularly members of Congress, to understand that we have to protect the investors. We cannot move with getting rid of the guardrails and doing what the crypto companies want us to do, put it over into CFTC, this little agency, because they think they don't have to be in compliance with anything. I yield back.
Well,
Yes,
and I'm grateful that they caught the people and that they've been punished, but it seems like there could have been some anticipatory action. But I'd be interested in Mr. Hill's response.
well, I thank the ranking member for her litany of the fraudsters that have been active in the crypto space. There's no doubt about that. But let me answer your question directly. Would this bill, if it had been enacted, prevent an FTX-type event from happening? And the answer is yes. And let me answer your question directly. This bill includes oversight over crypto exchanges, crypto dealers, crypto issuers. They have to meet capital standards. As Chairman Johnson says, there's no commingling of funds, which was an issue at FTX. FTX was offshore. It's a Bahamian company, and yet the SEC did nothing to prevent Americans from losing money in that business. And so the key thing is that this bill would have all those protections in place that would prohibit the exact issues that came to pass in FTX. And I would say one other thing. FTX did have a U.S. derivative subsidiary here in America, and guess what? It was regulated by the CFTC, and guess what? It was the only part of FTX that did not fail.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll go back to the chair.
The ranking member is recognized.
Thank you very much. As Mr. Hill talks about protections in this bill, first let's start with those companies who refuse to register with the SEC. That's number one. They want to be cleared of the laws that they have broken, and this bill would do that. Number two, ask him if in fact there is a space that is created in this bill that we call a no man's land, where not only the crypto companies, but some of our regular companies would find a way by which they don't have to be in compliance with anybody. And so not only does it go so far as to provide this space for crypto, we're talking about the average company that would be under the SEC that would also be able to utilize this space. Ask him.
Well, I think you
happy to
have.
answer both those
Yes, and I want to recognize you, and just wanted to let the gentleman from South Dakota know that I was coming to
On
him
the
as well.
first question, there's no failure to register here. In fact, anyone who is operating as in the commodity space or the security space as a digital asset dealer, broker, innovator, issuer, would, upon the passage of this bill enacted into law, would have automatically coverage by the SEC or the CFTC. They'd automatically be regulated. They're deemed to be regulated, waiting for the rules to be written by the Commission and the CFTC. This bill calls for the CFTC and the SEC to write their rules jointly. So there's immediate coverage of anyone who's, quote, unregistered. Secondly, there is no space in this bill that the ranking member is referring to that creates this loophole in the securities law. That's not correct. Let me read it to you, ranking member, so that I can try to be helpful. On page 66, section 202, treatment of investment contract assets, it says that the term investment contract assets means a fungible digital representation of value that can be exclusively possessed, transferred person to person, sold or transferred, but is not otherwise a security pursuant to the first sentence in the Act, meaning if it's a security, it's not covered. There is no gap. You're either security or you're a digital representation of value. The gap is closed. It's not there. We have lawyers on both sides of the aisle that have come and testified to our committee as we drafted this. So let me yield back to the ranking member.
Thank you, and I want to yield to Mr. Johnson, too.
So I just want to make sure that our record is clear here in a couple of ways. Number one, it has been alleged that the CFTC does not regulate offerings that are widely available to retail consumers. I just got to tell you, Mr. Chairman, that's not true in farm country. There are thousands of producers in my state alone that use products that are regulated by the CFTC to hedge their risk as risk management tools. This is absolutely what the CFTC does. And more to the point, they have a limited spot market authority over a broad range of commodities for fraud and manipulation. That fraud and manipulation is central to this issue of retail consumers, number one. Number two, the ranking member listed a number of proceedings and then alleged that this bill would shift the regulatory enforcement of those kinds of nefarious activities over to the CFTC. That is not accurate. To my knowledge, there is not one of those firms that would pass the 5-prong decentralization test found in Title I of this Act. If they don't meet the 5-prong decentralized test, they are not a digital commodity. They are not subject to market regulation by the CFTC. Instead, that regulation remains with the SEC. I would be happy to have the ranking member indicate a specific one of those companies that's met the 5-prong test.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, the gentlelady is recognized.
I anticipated that the discussion would raise the question, doesn't the investment contract asset language only apply to digital assets? No, the language in Title II regarding investment contract assets would allow any assets that meet this definition to exist in a regulatory void without a regulator, without any of the rules that govern securities or commodities. Contrary to the claims of Republicans, this bill creates a massive loophole that can be gamed to apply not only to crypto, but both crypto and traditional securities. The definition in the bill does not have language limiting it to digital assets. Instead, it refers to any, quote, fungible digital representation of value, unquote. this could very well apply to certain traditional securities. It could allow large companies like Apple, Facebook, and Tesla to structure offerings in a manner that meet this definition in order to take advantage of this regulatory no man's land. It is truly disturbing how this provision was inserted after the bill passed the committee. I yield back.
In the interest of moving the committee along, I'm going to recognize the ranking member.
No, and I will take the chairman's words seriously. I appreciate you all being here. I stated what I believe about these bills in my opening statement. Clearly, there's a disagreement amongst the panelists. I respect all of you, appreciate your being here, and I will yield back.
Gentleman yields back, Chair. Thanks, gentlemen. The gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to, I appreciate the conversation that's going on, and I was just wondering, Chairman Johnson, can you talk a little bit maybe about how it really will help the consumers? You know, we're talking some broad stuff and regulation stuff, but I think it's important to focus on how this is going to help consumers.
So let's look at FTX. What a debacle. I mean, everyday Americans lost real money because Congress had not spoken with a clear voice about what kind of regulatory regime should be in place to protect consumers. What we know is that the one part of FTX that was regulated under an American regulatory regime did not go under. And in fact, consumers lost no money through the American registered exchange that they had. It was the offshore pieces of the puzzle, regulated, if at all, through other environments, through other countries, that caused this problem. What this does, ma'am, is makes it clear that if you're going to be an intermediary doing business in this commodity space or in the digital asset space, and that is a security, that you are going to have to register. You will have to avoid commingling of funds. You will have a regular reporting requirement. You will have to submit yourself to participation in SROs on both sides of the ledger that have for decades worked to make sure that we have the most sound market regulatory regime in the world.
Will the gentleman yield? Oh, I'm sorry. Will the lady yield?
I'll yield.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Republicans want to attack the SEC under Chair Gensler, but let me show you some examples of what it would mean for investors if the SEC could no longer act. Earlier this year, on March 14th, the SEC took action against 17 individuals for their roles in a $300 million Ponzi scheme involving the company Crypto FX, which targeted more than 40,000 predominant Latino investors in the U.S. and 2 other countries. One of the architects of this scheme would peddle get-rich-quick lies. He would introduce himself by saying, "Who is Latino who would like to become a millionaire?" Jose Herrera lost $20,000 to this scheme, and Cicero Molina lost $200,000. He said at a press conference, "This was all my life." When BlockFi, a digital asset lending platform, filed for bankruptcy under the FTX collapse, Brett Carrillo lost access to about $30,000 worth of investments. He said to reporters this was about 1/3 of his entire savings, and that by my dreams of starting a company, retiring early, or being able to do something for my daughters who are gone. These devastating stories would proliferate if the bill becomes law. The question was about how does it help consumers? And I appreciate that. Because as we talk about crypto, and we talk about the SEC and the CFTC, and we talk about why they were created, what they have done, what their responsibilities are all about, it's a lot of information to try and depart to the members of Congress so that they could understand the dangers of this bill and the dangers to consumers. I'm glad you asked a plain question about how does this protect consumers, because it does not. it rips them off. It causes them to be able to tell the kinds of stories that I've just shared with
Well,
you
I would
about
beg
their
to
hopes
differ
they
on
dream.
that. I
Thank
would
you.
beg to differ
Thank you.
that I think that this actually adds to the protection of consumers, and stories like that won't happen anymore. Did you want to add anything, Chairman?
I would only observe, ma'am, that that entity that the ranking member mentioned would not pass the five-pronged decentralization test in Title I, would not be subject to the CFTC, would remain under the jurisdiction of the SEC. She seems to trust the SEC. Their ability to regulate under that type of circumstance would not be destroyed by this bill. This is, I think there's a lot of misinformation out there.
Thank you very much. And Chairman Hill, maybe you could help me out with, you talked about some of the potential risks with CBDC on the taxpayer, but I was wondering about the privacy and the privacy issue, and maybe you could just talk a little bit to that, how this is going to help with the privacy issue.
Well, the ranking member mentioned that some 135 countries are studying central bank digital currencies. That's true, but no one I know of has actually implemented one in a major developed nation that has a diverse, large economy like the United States. And the one place where you see it most talked about and most discussed and written about is, of course, the #1 authoritarian surveillance state in the world, which is China. And it's flopping in China. People don't want to be spied on. And the risk of this is when you give the government the authority to have people banking at the Fed and debit their checking account, put their money in a central bank digital currency that they would then spend, you've got the risk of your privacy being violated. And we've already seen that in this administration and in the Obama administration through Operation Choke Point of work at the CFPB. So I don't think Americans want to have another methodology where big government can have some Orwellian approach to see how they spend their money. And that's why I think it's important that we pass this bill. It's important for privacy. And the administration, the second point is that the Federal Reserve under any administration can't do this without strict authorization of Congress. We, under Article 1, control the coinage of the money and how that's allocated. And so it's a constitutional issue, and I think this is a good bill to vote for.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Anticipating this question on privacy, I'm pleased that my Republican colleagues join Democrats in their concern for privacy and privacy protections. I would note that my home state of California was the first in the country to enact serious reforms into law to protect data privacy for consumers back in 2018. But the privacy concerns that the sponsors seek to address through this bill are overblown because there's nothing inherent about CBDC, especially not one that might be developed in the U.S. The bill's sponsor has warned that a U.S. CBDC would mirror the surveillance tactics that are baked into Chinese CBDC without explaining why the U.S. would ever choose to design its CBDC in a manner that mimics Chinese surveillance. We wouldn't do that. Privacy protections at a nation's desired level can be incorporated from the earliest development stages onward as the technology and coding are selected and as standards are determined. This is something that many other privacy-focused jurisdictions have been incorporating into their CBDC development, like the European Union, because guess what? Their constituents care about privacy also. And so, when you talk about privacy, it is a major concern of CBDCs, and that's why the Fed now is doing the work to research, to examine, to explore before we do our CBDCs. But we do not want to be left out of the world as all of the central banks have adopted CBDCs. And I do believe that the work that is being done by the Feds will lead us into CBDCs that will be designed in a way that offer cash-like privacy, such as using zero-knowledge proofs, encryption, and other design features where a payment validator processes and approves transactions but does not learn the identities involved in the payments without the permission of the parties. These technologies, while not readily available yet, are examples of those which aim to solve the exact problem that this bill claims is only solvable through a permanent ban. Further, there are wholesale CBDCs that only financial institutions, not consumers, could use to help them to move money quickly and efficiently in cross-border transactions with other financial institutions. This has the potential of reducing transaction costs and improving payment speed, and do not necessarily pose the same privacy concerns the individual consumers have, because they only involve transactions at the institutional level. This bill's broad, irresponsible language manages to ban those also. This is by the way, is despite the fact that the New York Fed has been conducting pilot programs through its New York Innovation Center to test the benefits and drawbacks of such a wholesale CBDC in collaboration with U.S. banks and Monetary Authority of Singapore. Again, these pilot programs and America's ability to shape CBDC privacy standards globally would come to a screaming halt if this bill were enacted. To be sure, the other global projects will continue to move forward, but America's role will be stunted. I'll add that it is unclear why Republicans are so worried about consumer privacy concerns in this one regard, while far more valid consumer privacy concerns abound in our financial marketplace. Today, we have data brokers that buy and collect all kinds of data about consumers with little awareness or ability for a consumer to control who has their information and for what purpose. Early last year, Chairman McHenry had rushed to mark up a broad data privacy bill that had some serious flaws, which contained some good ideas too. But instead of focusing on how we can protect consumer financial data more broadly through bipartisan consensus, Republicans are pushing forward yet another partisan bill that would do absolutely nothing to resolve real consumer privacy concerns that are actually impacting our financial markets today. And so I urge members to reject this anti-innovation bill, and I reserve the balance of my time. Thank you.
Chairman Towns.
I thank Ms. Fischbach for her indulgence. Earlier, the ranking member gave us a litany of enforcement actions taken by the SEC, and I wouldn't want anybody to think that there's only one cop on the beat doing their job. I won't read you the litany, but I would give you an overview that in FY23, the CFTC brought enforcement actions against Sam Bankman-Fried, Gary Wang, Alameda, Binance, Celsius, Alex Mashinsky, Uki Dao, Avram Eisenberg, and many, many others. We have two trustworthy, reliable, proven regulators that do different things. We will have a stronger regulatory environment with them both engaged.
Thank you, and I appreciate that, and I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for question.
I'll be brief. You know, when I hear the Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX, you know who I blame? The investors. I mean, would I get on an airplane with two wheels missing and one wing? Sam Bankman-Fried was in the Bahamas. He had no board of directors. All of us have been on boards with different groups. He had no, he could commingle funds. He didn't have to report to anybody. So the investors, I don't blame Congress, Dusty. I mean, we can regulate out the wazoo, and we're suffering from it today with an overzealous regulatory environment, CFPB with their fines, SEC. But my God, the investor has to do his homework, and it wasn't done with Sam Bankman-Fried. And, you know, we can criticize, I mean, you can't legislate crooks. There's always a way around it. I deal with developers all the time. I've been burned by them, but it doesn't happen but once. Darcy with me is dealing with a guy that bought stock over the counter. That's risky, and he's paying a price. So I don't, I'm done with regulations as far as, but if they make sense, I think your bill makes sense. My question, explain to me the regime Fit 21. Tell me exactly what that does.
I thank the gentleman from South Carolina, and I think you're 100% right. I mean, there's no one on this panel on either side of the aisle that's for fraud. Everyone here is for let the buyer beware. Everybody has their own responsibility for due diligence. In the FTX question, one of the things I think was shocking to all of us was how many institutional investors of some of the smartest people in America gave Sam Bankman-Fried money at this place in the Bahamas and lost it. And people followed the Pied Piper off into the sea on that one, literally. So this bill creates what we think, it looks at the criminal activities that we've just discussed and the fraud. It looks at the court cases where there's disputes between the CFTC and the SEC about whether something's a commodity or a security. And this bill, in just a few pages, gives that clarity. So, Mr. Norman, what it does is it says, it defines, are you a commodity or a security? That's number one. Number two, it tells you how you can be a broker of either that security or that commodity, how you have to register, what rules you have to follow, just like if you're a stockbroker today or a real estate broker. It tells you if you're an exchange where you trade those commodities or trade those securities, that's a digital asset, what rules do you have to have? What capital do you have to put up? It has rules around custody, like you can't commingle funds. You have to have rules of custody, which we voted on this House floor last week to overturn the bad direction the SEC's taken on digital asset custody, the staff accounting bulletin. So it lays out those rules of the road so that if you're an inventor, an innovator, and you want to write an application on a blockchain, it shows you how to do that. If you're a consumer, it tells you what you ought to be reading in the buyer beware portion, what disclosure is necessary, what financial disclosure should you look for. And then if you're a regulator, you now know this is a security, this is a commodity, and these are the expectations of everybody in that marketplace. That's what Fit 21 does.
And who is responsible for reading the material and educating themselves?
So just like we have in today's world, if you're a broker and you want to deal in digital assets, you'll be a member of FINRA, the Financial Regulatory Agency that regulates stockbrokers. We have a Financial Futures Association that regulates commodity brokers. And they will provide that disclosure to those consumers, just like they do if they buy a mutual fund today, a stock today, or trade in options. Those kinds of disclosures will now be available for things that are now considered digital assets, either a security or a commodity.
So mainly this lays out guidelines.
It lays out guidelines. It clears out this the legal confusion between a commodity and a security and the rules of how to operate in those two environments. And let me yield some time to Mr. Johnson from a commodity perspective.
Mr. Norman, I love how you laid this out because our regulators are not merit regulators. They don't tell you whether or not something is a good investment or not. What they do is they make sure that people are playing by some basic rules of the road and that there is substantial disclosure for consumers to make a determination about whether or not something is a good investment.
Well, the gentleman
There is
here,
such a thing as risk versus reward. And we all get opportunities to invest, but you got to do your research and figure which ones make sense versus which ones that do not make sense. Sam Bankman-Fried, you could be deaf and blind and figure out this would not be a good stock to invest in. You're dealing with somebody who's violating the basics, and I don't know how the ones that object, the ones that lost the money, a lot of the blame goes right back on them. Now, they were dealing with a crook, and it's up to you to find out who that is. Look at the track record, and he hadn't done it. Ms. Waters, yeah, I'll be glad to.
thank you,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Norman. I appreciate that. The question is, isn't it true that there's ambiguity about whether crypto is a security or a commodity? And you just had a lot of discussion on that. No, that is not true. SEC chairs under both Democratic and Republican administrations.
Ms. Waters, can I reclaim my time and let him respond to that direct?
I have not, if I could impose on the gentleman.
Okay,
to
okay, go
Allow me
ahead.
to finish.
I yield.
I would appreciate it very much. No, that is not true. SEC chairs under both Democratic and Republican administrations have agreed that nearly all crypto tokens are securities and therefore fall under robust securities framework of the SEC. And the courts have also overwhelmingly agreed with the SEC in dozens of cases that not only is the SEC the arbiter of what is a security, it has agreed with the SEC's conclusion about crypto. This is a framework that is applied to all securities for more than 90 years withstanding numerous technological advancement and helping to make our capital markets the envy of the world. And the SEC is enforcing that framework. The SEC has been at the forefront of ensuring that crypto-related companies are complying with applicable securities laws. To date, the SEC, under 2 Democratic and 1 Republican chair, has taken over 170 enforcement actions against crypto criminals, more than 70 of which were levied during the chair's Gensler's tenure. Our security laws were designed to adapt to broader technological changes. In one of the last opinions written by Associate Justice Thurgood Marshall, the Supreme Court stated, and I quote, "In defining the scope of the market that it wished to regulate, Congress painted with a broad brush. It recognized the virtually limited scope in the creation of countless and variable schemes. Congress, therefore, did not attempt precisely to cabin the scope of securities acts. Rather, it enacted a definition of security sufficiently broad to encompass virtually any instrument that might be sold as an investment," quote unquote. What we need right now is not a separate light touch frame for crypto. Rather, we need more resources for the SEC enforcement and additional SEC authorities to go after crypto overseas, which would have helped protect American investors from FTX collapse. The Financial Stability Oversight Board has raised other narrow policy changes, such as providing the government with more visibility of crypto business affiliates and subsidiaries. This approach would be similar to how we oversee the banks. FSOC also recommended that the CFTC should have spot market oversight for any crypto that is not deemed to be securities. And so, having said that, these narrow proposed changes would ensure responsible innovation rather than rewriting decades of case law and weakening our safeguards for investors and consumers, as this bill would do. I yield back.
Ms. Waters, where you and I have a disagreement is you would regulate, where, you mentioned overseas. There's no way you can regulate that tight enough to let industries operate. There is such a thing as common sense. You invest overseas with your money, you're making a risk. Same things with all the funds that have China involved with it. So let me let Congressman Johnson and Congressman Hill respond to specifically what you mentioned.
Thank you.
Reasonable people can disagree about provisions of this bill, sir, but there is ambiguity. I don't care who you are, you need to know there's ambiguity. I mean, if somebody wants to take up their phone and type in Ether or Ethereum, Gary Gensler, SEC, you will see over the course of a number of years, in part because of a changing fact pattern, the SEC has changed their opinion about whether or not that is a commodity or whether it's a security. The SEC has authorized ETFs for offerings on a commodity exchange. And now they're asserting that it's a security. If that is an ambiguity, I don't know what is.
And the court cases are also creating that ambiguity. We literally have the commission going into federal court saying something is a commodity, and we're having the SEC go into court and say it's a security. And to the ranking member's comments, this bill clearly gives spot market authority as requested by the CFTC in the bill, as requested by Secretary Yellen in the FSOC report. We deal with that, but we also deal with the ambiguity about this definition of what is a security and what's a commodity. We actually take that case law that the ranking member is referring to, and we write a statute. Congress actually does Article I authority. We actually define a 5-part test to determine if something, a new idea, should be treated as a security or a commodity, and we actually have them under the purview of the SEC, the ranking member's preferred regulator, and the SEC in this bill has the authority to make the determination whether something remains as a restricted security under SEC purview or becomes a commodity and subject to the exchange rules and trading rules of the CFTC. So we actually design this, and that's why we call it fit for purpose. It absolutely is fit for purpose and answers the litigation and risks that we've seen. And I think that's responsive to your question. The XRP case, Ripple, which was litigated in federal court, came back and created more confusion, actually, in our markets by protecting institutional investors and not protecting retail investors, the exact opposite of the way our laws are traditionally written, creating more federal, I think, confusion that this bill cleans up.
So you're not worried about the overreach that we're seeing on all the agencies now, SEC mainly. You don't think that by creating this will give them another avenue to, the way I see it, is really clearing things up. It's not I don't see this as a added regulation that's going to cripple the industry like we've seen so much. And I keep going back. You can regulate all you want, but you're not going to stop crooks from doing the things that they will do, and it's buyer beware on a lot of these things. As Mr. McGovern said, you can have honest disagreements, and I think there's an honest disagreement, Ms. Waters, with here, but thank y'all for, I'm going to vote for the bill. Thank you for putting it up. You explained it well. Y'all are well versed on this, so I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Pennsylvania for questions.
Yield some time to Mr. McGovern.
I just want to say to Mr. Norman, I think we people from Massachusetts have a different definition of brief than you people from South Carolina. But thank you.
Would the gentleman clarify, did you say grief or brief?
Brief, both.
Very good. That's fair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am, trying to wrap my arms around what all of this is attempting to do, and the two big concerns that I'm hearing are, first of all, why do we need a new regulatory structure? It's actually a little surprising that our Republican colleagues are suggesting kind of building out a whole new regulatory structure, because usually you're in here arguing that we need less. So the idea that there would be a new bureaucracy to advance this is concerning. And the second thing is, I'm just really most concerned because most of my contact with the crypto industry has been when constituents are being defrauded. So my big concern is, how do we help them? So Ranking Member Waters, can you address either of those points?
Thank you very much. In anticipating, some of the questions and some of the discussion, we really wanted to help everyone understand why the CFTC has been the crypto industry regulator of choice from the beginning. Let's start with the substantial difference in funding and staff for the CFTC compared to the SEC. In 2023, the CFTC employed roughly 680 full-time employees with an annual budget of $365 million, while the SEC employed over 4,500 and had a budget of $2 billion. And so why do I make this point? Because the CFTC does not have the experience, does not have the resources, is not of the size, and truly is a commodity agency. The SEC, on the other side, even with the limited funding provided to the CFTC under this bill, which expires after 4 years, it becomes nowhere close to matching the SEC's resources. The additional obligations in this legislation would newly come under CFTC's remit would stretch the small agency's resources, which would ultimately weaken enforcement of this market and make it easier for bad actors in the crypto space to evade existing regulations. Of course, the crypto industry would like to have it under the CFTC, because that way they won't have the experience, the knowledge, the ability to go into court and to fight and to fine and to do what needs to happen to crypto who have failed even at this point to register, who are unlawful. And so this would be their choice. Take it over to the smaller agency with not the background, who deals with commodities, not really securities. Moreover, the CFTC was never designed to deal with retail investors and consumers. It is instead designed to deal with sophisticated institutional investors and traders. Therefore, CFTC lacks rules to protect retail investors and consumers compared to the protections that exist under the SEC. For example, investors would also lose a private right of action, enforcement by states, enforcement by the SEC, and assurance of fiduciary duty to make more sure that entities act in the best interest of the investor, disclosures and protections against conflicts of interest. Let me let you in on a secret that the big crypto doesn't want you to know, even under this bill. CFTC does not get enough authority to regulate crypto in this bill. For example, while Section 107 of this bill preserves existing CFTC authority to enforce laws against fraud, manipulation, or false reporting, it does not expand the CFTC's current authority, which lacks preventive authorities to stop fraud before it starts. This is in stark contrast to SEC's authorities, which include the authority to require important financial disclosures and help investors spot questionable developments or accounting practices before they make a purchase. Furthermore, the companies making these disclosures are liable for their shareholders for any material misstatements of fact, which further serves to deter registrants from misleading investors. In addition to that, we have these crypto companies who have refused to register. They're operating against the law. This bill protects them as it moves forward from the fact that they have been unlawful. And so the CFTC is not capable. It is not written into this bill, the guardrails that is being claimed. And so there's no reason why this bill, it's a very bad bill, it's one of the worst that I've ever seen, should become law. I yield back.
Okay, and it's still my time, but I see Mr. Johnson would like to say something, and I just asked if you could make it sort of a Massachusetts minute as opposed to
Yes.
maybe a South Dakota
Well,
minute.
I do want to make sure the record is accurate, ma'am, so thank you for your indulgence. Let's correct some misconceptions. Number one, not a whole new regulatory framework, since the Commodity Exchange Act of 1922 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. This has been the bifurcation in our economy. The CFTC, well, the SEC deals with securities. The CFTC deals with intermediaries and derivatives markets related to non-security commodities. This is how we do it. This bill just clarifies that existing bifurcation for the modern era, number one. Number two, the idea that the CFTC doesn't deal with complex financial instruments is laughable to a point of disbelief on my part. Dodd-Frank...
We didn't say that.
Dodd-Frank, maybe the ranking member didn't.
No.
But certainly some have alleged that, they don't deal with complex financial instruments. Dodd-Frank provided the CFTC oversight over the swaps market, depending on how you count it, $300 billion or $500 billion marketplace. Every product within the CFTC's jurisdiction is a complex financial instrument. And the idea that they don't deal with the regulation of retail products is, again, not consistent with the fact that the CFTC regulates retail FX markets. The CFTC regulates retail leveraged commodity markets. This is what they do. We have two time-tested, proven, reliable regulators, we will be better off if they are both engaged.
Thank you. It does feel as though, well, first of all, I've seen a lot of lobbying activity among the legal community here on the Hill, promoting this as the solution, and certainly it's on behalf of well-financed crypto companies. I've seen skepticism, and I guess I share the skepticism of which regulatory framework is going to better protect citizens, the retail market, as I guess we're calling them here. So that remains my
Would the gentleman
primary
yield on
concern.
just that one narrow
Sure.
point? So the ranking member says that somehow these crypto companies are selecting the, quote, lighter touch CFTC regime. But that's just not what this bill does at all. No, hold on. Madam, let me have my time, madam. This bill has the SEC determine if something is a security or a commodity.
Okay.
And so as a result, it's up to the Securities Commission that the ranking member supports fully. And she argues that most all these tokens are already securities. So it's in the hands in this bill of the SEC and the SEC Commission to determine whether something is eligible for commodity CFTC regulation. And we do have the funding for the CFTC. This bill funds the CFTC fully for the request that Chairman Benham has made to the Congress for the support of this bill. And so they also have more robust resources. I yield back to this lady.
Okay. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Ranking Member?
Let me just say that if this was a simple bill that did nothing more than saying, this is a security, this is a commodity, this is a commodity, this is, it wouldn't be such a problem. But this is a comprehensive piece of legislation. This comprehensive piece of legislation does not have guardrails. Again, it creates a no man's land where not only crypto, but other traditional securities could go and have no regulation whatsoever. This is a comprehensive piece of bill that undermines the authority of the SEC that has been developed, working, and protecting us as a cop on the block for 90 years. And so I disagree that this is a simple bill that just says this is a commodity and this is a security.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Welcome.
I yield back.
Sure, thanks, the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Texas is recognized for questions.
Thank the chairman. I thank all y'all for being here and testifying. And I'll try to be brief. He's covered these things. With respect to the CDBC issue, with respect to a central digital bank currency. If I'm correct, right, was it in March, what year is this, 24? In March of 22, like 2 years ago, President Biden signed an executive order, right, exploring the pros, cons, benefits, the path forward or whatever on such a concept, right? So it's not without concern that this is something that's right in front of us as a nation, right? I would assume this is should be one of the less partisan things that we should be putting forward. That regardless of one's ideology or political bent, that the concept of any government being able to insert itself into the currency that is being used to carry out free enterprise between an American citizen and another American citizen engaging in commerce, and therefore then use the power of government to influence the choices in commerce beyond what we already do with respect to tax policy, with respect to other levers of governmental power, that is the genesis behind what we're trying to do here with prohibition. Mr. Hill, would you be able to expand on that a little bit? I know you said so in your opening statement, but I think it's really critical for people to understand. People always they always try to kind of mock or laugh at the slippery slope arguments, and I've yet to seen a slippery slope argument made over the last 20 years that hasn't roughly been correct for the most part. And so I would just suggest that if we go down the road of CDBC, that this government would be able to insert itself into policy choices on right and left right? You know, this money cannot be used for an abortion. This money cannot be used for a purchase of a gun. This money can be used only for charging a car versus buying gas, or this money can be used, pick your ideological spectrum. It's happened in real time in other governments around the country, notably in China. I just wonder again if the gentleman from Arkansas would expand on that a little bit, because I think it's central to some of the concerns Americans have.
I thank the gentleman from Texas, and I don't share his affection for A&M baseball and the defeat of the Razorbacks over the weekend.
Two out of three, it is.
But I do share his concern over this particular notion, and I think that I make the following points. One, the ambiguity that somehow a central bank in our government could issue a retail, what we think is a retail central bank digital currency, which is where our citizens, our businesses would have accounts at the Fed and transact activity in the central bank digital currency, that could be done without a strict authorization oversight by Congress. That's point one where I agree with you. I think there's bipartisan opposition to that. And we've had bills on the floor. In fact, I've co-sponsored a bill with the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Auchincloss, in opposition to it, because under Article 1, it's quite clear that we are responsible for the money coinage and that we've delegated that to the Treasury, and the Treasury has got the Federal Reserve in a distribution fiscal agent status. Number two, I think people should be concerned about the potential of abuse in a situation like that for their privacy and their transactions. And why would they feel that way? I think because of the pattern and practice that they've seen over just the time I've served in Congress. Operation Choke Point, just to name one. So I think we want to make sure that we err on caution by prohibiting this and by saying again, reiterating, it can't be done without authorization of the Congress. Third and final point. In my judgment, the current chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Jay Powell, agrees with that. But guess what? The comments have been ambiguous at the Fed and in the administration. And so I think it's important that Article 1, branch of the government, speak clearly here, and that's why I'm in favor of this bill, and I yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
So the gentleman, you?
I will if in 1 second, if I can follow up and then open it up to the gentlelady. Unlike current dollars in circulation, now obviously we use credit cards, obviously we use Venmo, and let me just say that on Venmo, right? Are there not current efforts by the IRS to say transactions over a certain dollar amount, like $600, and Venmo should have greater scrutiny and greater, reporting and potential regulation? Is that not something that is happening in real time? And unlike, and then I'll add to that, you can answer that, unlike currency, to the extent we still use currency, that this has a digital tether, right? I mean, there is a connection, a connectivity in terms of what you're talking about in the currency. So putting aside the extent to which we've gone, heavily digital with respect to credit cards, you've got a one-to-one relationship with your credit card company and the systems in place, which of course are regulated. Here, when you go straight up to a currency with that kind of a tether, that there is really, to a significant extent, no real limit other than us on what the government can then do with that, whether it's freezing or seizing assets, with respect to, as I was mentioning before, programming spending. And, I might just say, like, when we talk about these items, you brought up Operation Choke Point. I would also say we saw a lot of these questions, again, without raising the issues of debates that unfortunately got somewhat partisan, but I think we had some agreement and disagreement during COVID. Well, the extent to which government power was being used to then effectuate what citizens could or could not do, would not such a currency give significant and greater power for the government to do that, regardless of the merits? Whatever one thinks about masks and vaccines, mandates, whether you can leave 6 feet circles, whatever the hell you want to go down the line of talking about COVID. Wouldn't such a mechanism provide a significant amount more power to the government to be able to effectuate the policies that were trying to be carried out during COVID? But the gentleman expand on those couple of questions, and then I'll turn it to the gentlelady.
Implemented at a retail level with direct accounts, it absolutely would. And I think people have a right, as I said, to be concerned about their privacy. That would be the ultimately non-private activity. And I'll give you one other more contemporary example rather than choke point, and that's a debate we've had in the House Financial Services Committee for several Congresses, but intensely last week when we supported a bill by Barry Loudermilk of Georgia on something called the Consolidated Audit Trail that collects everybody's stock trades every day in every brokerage account and are not protecting PII, the personal information associated with that. And that would allow someone to mix that with open source data and triangulate in a major another database for a hack that makes TikTok look benign. And so this risk is on the top of minds, I think, of the American people. And that's, again, why I think implemented as you describe it, yes, it should be of serious concern to our families for their privacy rights. And I think they have had examples recently, in our recent past, that would indicate the government's a terrible privacy protector. I'll yield back to the gentleman.
The gentlelady had wanted to make a comment.
Yes, thank you so very much. Currently, the Federal Reserve is engaged in a pilot project that looks at how distributed ledger technology can be used to improve efficiency of cross-border payments and settlements involving multiple currency. This is occurring in coordination with other G7 countries, which are also engaged in similar projects to speed up and lower the cost of doing business around the world. Furthermore, all G20 countries are doing the same. In making the United States the only country on the planet to ban a Cbdc is just unthinkable. But let me repeat that the only country to prohibit a Cbdc would be what Representative Emmer's isolationist bill would do in stopping this testing in its tracks. It would undercut America's commitment to its allies and seriously impair our ability to influence the standards adopted by other nations as we forge ahead with CBDC. All I'm saying is this, if I may, and that is, we don't want to be seen as a country that's not futuristic enough to at least look at it, to explore it, to test, to find out. Right now, we're the only country that is proposing, any of our members proposing a ban. All I'm saying is, let's not stop what the Fed is doing in trying to do the research.
So look, I appreciate the exchange with the gentlelady.
Yes.
I would make two comments. One, the idea that America being alone in choosing a path is probably, in my mind, a indication that that path might be a good one. That's just a personal observation about the tendencies of our of other countries around the world. And I kind of like it when America's thinking independently and trying to think about figuring out how we're going to preserve liberty and make sure that we don't have government control of currency. And I would note, and I say this as a positive, the gentlelady was on the floor when we were having a significant amount of debate and a hotly contested vote that I think I might have disagreed with some of my Republican colleagues on the panel about warrants as it related to FISA. And I would note a overall philosophy for me that I shared. The gentlelady made a comment on the floor saying, you said I'm old enough to remember, respectfully, I'm quoting you, old enough to remember J. Edgar Hoover. And you made the point on the floor about the extent to which the empowerment of government is concerning. And I would just note in this instance, where I might have had some disagreements with my colleagues on this side of the aisle and the other side of the aisle on that particular vote, you and I were aligned on that vote, I would just posit here for consideration that what we're doing here, what we're attempting to do, is to Congress speak up and say, no, you're not going to do this. You're not going to go empower government to be able to control a currency at the level that we believe can be foisted on the American people this way. And that does not foreclose continued debate, investigation, discussion about where that would go. We can have plenty of committee hearings. We can have plenty of consideration. Fed can research whatever the hell it wants to research, but we could have a debate about this. But my only point is, I believe it is critically important that Congress speak to say that the power of government should not be used to allow government to be inserted between our use of currency and engaging in free enterprise. But with that, in the interest of time, I will yield back to the chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico for questions.
Thank you so very much. And it strikes me that we have dealt with numerous bills in this committee, and they range from bills coming out of financial services to bills coming out of the different committees. And there seems to be a trend that oftentimes so many of these bills favor the wealthiest corporations, the wealthiest investors, at the expense of consumers, of regular investors, of everyday working Americans and families. Now, these bills, these financial services bills we're looking at today, some might say, well, oh, these are very complex, right? They're too complex for everyday Americans. But in reality, it strikes me that regulatory oversight, especially in the financial markets, is key to American financial stability. That the reason that we had the Great Depression was because there wasn't significant and appropriate regulatory oversight of the financial markets. So we had a slew of bills that came out of that. We had savings and loan debacle. We had 2008. We have had numerous instances where the lack of oversight has hurt Americans, even if they are not engaged investors, right? So that strikes me that that's an overarching issue here. So when people say we can't have government oversight, no, government does and plays a very important role, especially in the financial markets, because even if you're not an investor, you're going to be implicated if we melt down. So I wanted to, looking at this, I saw that there was significant amendments, Democratic amendments that have been placed before the Rules Committee. And it looks like many of those Democratic amendments are intended to make sure that we don't have money laundering, that we determine are there issues around cryptocurrency, that they're intended to provide protections. Now, I take it those amendments are here, and some of the amendments are to strike issues that came into the bill that were placed after it came out of committee. I saw one from Sean Casten that looked like it was after the committee. So just speaking to the issue of those Democrat amendments, can you just summarize quickly, Ranking Member, why they were important and why it's disappointing that we didn't see them out of committee and why Rules should consider them?
Thank you very much. Without first speaking specifically to the amendments, early on in our testimony, I tried to show an example of what happens when we don't take responsibility to ensure that there are regulations that would protect not only our investors, but all of our citizens. And I want to share that with you because we think this is one of the most harmful bills that could ever raise its ugly head in the Congress of the United States. I said it reminds me of the time that Congress passed the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, or CFMA, which passed in 2000 in response to intense lobbying by the financial industry. What we see now, intense lobbying, claiming that the bill would provide legal clarity and promote innovation. At that time, the chair of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, Brooksley Bourne, warned that failing to put guardrails around so-called over-the-counter derivatives would cause significant harm. But Congress instead listened to the financial services industry, pressing to ensure there were no rules. And I want to tell you, less than a decade later, those same derivatives blew up our economy when AIG collapsed because of its unregulated derivatives exposures. And now Congress is hearing similar arguments about the need to take off the guardrails for crypto. Well, without going any further, what you just said was, shouldn't we be, if we're not, making sure that we have guardrails and protect our investors and protect, our consumers? Yes, we should. We have to do that. And those amendments that you referred to are attempts to do that. Those amendments about, wait, guys, really take a look at what you're doing. If you do these kinds of things, if you undermine the SEC's ability to be the regulator that has developed over 90 years with all of its successes, and in the way that it is now even dealing with crypto, even though crypto industries are not registering and they're acting unlawful. They have more resources than the CTFTC. They have, more background, more experiences, and this bill does not match for the CFTC the guardrails that are in the SEC, who not only have been doing this over this 90-year period of time, but they are successful in the court battles, many of them that they have. This takes a lot of work. They have the personnel. They have all of that. So when we have amendments, we're attempting to make sure that there are guardrails. And when we see that there's some attempt not to have guardrails, we have to have amendments to say, no, you can't do this.
So I know Mr. Johnson, it's like I asked a general question, laid out a thing, because I had hands raised, right? So we don't always have hands raised in the Rules Committee, but we are respectful of the discussion that would be had, and you and I work well on many issues. So what did you call it? A Manhattan Minute in New Mexico. In Massachusetts, in New Mexico, we love short and sweet, but Mr. Johnson.
I am glad you raised the issue of consumer protection because it is critically important. And listen, I've got to applaud the ranking member on the Digital Assets Committee on Agriculture, Yadira Caraveo. She has been laser focused on consumer protection. There are dozens of amendments that were integrated into the text before you through this process because Ms. Caraveo and others on Ag worked so hard to get it in there. Now, you don't need to take my word for it. A letter that Mr. Nickel, who's also been a champion for consumer protection behind this bill, and Ms. Caraveo led jointly, they talk about, and these are their wording, their words from the letter. They say, ma'am, that this bill advances consumer protection. They say that it mitigates risk to consumers. They say that it strengthens market integrity. They say that it enhances anti-money laundering compliance.
In that area.
And right now.
And I think because I saw that there are many additional amendments that were submitted to rules with regards to the general area of this, including, I thought I saw one from Yadira, but I might not be remembering.
But they're talking about the bill as a whole. Yeah. And right now, there is no federal regulator over spot market activity in digital assets. No, there's no cop on the beat. And what we know is that
I think that's the issue, because if there's not a cop on the beat, don't we want to make sure we have a well resourced officer, right? And I think that strikes me that's the tension of what we're seeing here, is that do we have a well resourced officer with the guardrails that this industry demands, especially as we move into an era where we are moving to a place that we really haven't been before. And part of our problem is that we have been behind the technological curve, right? We have not caught up. And when we are going to be looking at, let's make sure that we have strong enough guardrails. And I think that's the tension that we're seeing. Do we have enough of that? It strikes me as I read the materials and didn't sit through those numerous committee hearings, but it's our job here on Rules to get up to speed as quickly as possible and try to understand where are the issues that we want to say, what is this bill in essence, what is the essence of the bill and what it does to that bigger picture for Americans, and on whose side is Congress going to be standing? I want to make sure that we are standing on the right side, because my community, as you well know, is a rural community that does not have a lot of resources. It's a tribal community that there are a couple of really great players in this field, but for the most part, they're people who are relying on a financial market that works. And I know we're getting late, so I'm going to kind of bring it to a close. Did you want to, since we only get 4, I'm going to give ranking
Well,
member a last.
yes, if you don't mind yielding, absolutely, I will take the time. Republicans want to attack the SEC under Chair Gensler, but let me show you some of the, examples of what it would mean for investors if the SEC could no longer act. Earlier this year, on March 14, the SEC took action against 17 individuals for their roles in a $300 million Ponzi scheme involving the company CryptoFX, which targeted more than 40,000 predominantly Latino investors in the United States and 2 other countries. One of the architects of this scheme would peddle these get-rich-quick lies. He would introduce himself by saying, "Who is a Latino who would like to become a millionaire?" Jose Herrera lost $20,000 to this scheme, and Cicero Molina lost $200,000. He said in a press conference, "This is all my life." When BlockFi, a digital asset lending platform, filed for bankruptcy under the FTX collapse, Brett Correa lost access to about $30,000 worth of investments. He said to reporters this was about 1/3 of his entire savings, and that, quote, "My dreams of starting a company, retiring early, or being able to do something for my daughter are gone." These devastating stories would proliferate if this bill becomes law. If you're saying they accepted some amendments to ensure that this didn't happen, I don't know what those amendments are.
So I think that, thank you
yeah.
very much, Ranking Member. And I think
Yeah.
that this issue of how this complex new technology is marketed and how, I mean, we've all seen it. We've seen the big headlines, but what you've done is you've highlighted how the people who might not have the sophistication, but have a desire to see their investments multiplied, may be easily preyed upon if we do not have the kind of cop on the beat to be helping out to make sure this doesn't happen. I think that that's the overall concern, and I take it that the Republicans don't think that that's where we're going with this, but you can see where our concern for the communities we represent comes from, and I hope you realize that, and you will have 3 other times to respond because we have 3 Republicans after me. But you want to just give a couple of minutes to it. I mean, not a couple of minutes, a couple
I
of
just would say,
sentences.
if the gentleman from New Mexico is concerned about fraud and manipulation and no disclosure and consumer harm, then you should be for this bill. Like the Democrats that supported this bill in the Ag Committee and in the Financial Service Committee in the markup, this bill is directly responsive to President Biden's call in his executive order for a regulatory gap being closed. This bill is exactly what he called for in the FSOC report to regulate spot markets for the FSOC. So we make the SEC's oversight of digital more robust in this bill, and we open up the ability to do that in the Commodities and Future Trading Commission, where they have no rules whatsoever there. So I just make that point that this is to protecting consumers.
Yeah, and thank you. And I think that is the desire to see how do we take on this market, but how do we make sure we do it in a way that is significantly comprehensive with the kind of guardrails we've talked about. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, Chair. Thanks, the gentlelady. The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panelists for being here. Good to see the ranking member and Chairman Hill from Financial Services Committee and Mr. Johnson from South Dakota on behalf of the Ag Committee. Thank you for being here. I'm going to try to unpack this a little bit. So we've heard that Chairman Gensler of the SEC has repeatedly and unambiguously stated that most digital assets are in fact securities. So even if it is true that most digital assets are in fact securities, Mr. Johnson, does that mean that all digital assets are securities?
Everybody of which I'm aware in this regulatory space acknowledges that no, not all digital assets are securities. And in fact, Bitcoin is, again, regarded by everybody of which I'm aware to be not a security. And that means that in excess of 70% of the market volume around digital assets is not jurisdictional to the SEC. That's what I think we really want to point out in the line of questioning from Ms. Ledger-Fernandez. The SEC only does securities. That means that if we don't have another cop on the beat, this is a less regulated area and consumers are at risk of being harmed. I would also note, as long as you're asking kind of about the regulatory lines, the ranking member talked about, again, we have these boogeymen that are advanced, and the suggestion that this bill would somehow remove the SEC's ability to act. That is not true. BlockFi, nothing in this bill would keep the SEC from providing oversight over BlockFi. They were a lending platform. Their loans were securities. Nothing in this transaction, these transactions would have met the 5-pronged decentralization test in Title I. This was a problem. It is a problem that this bill simply does not address.
So we know that not all digital assets are in fact securities, and FIT 21 requires registration as either a digital security or a digital commodity. Digital securities then would be within the SEC, a digital commodity would be within the CFTC. Is there currently any way for a digital asset commodity company that's in the spot market transaction business to currently register with either the SEC or the CFTC?
That is a great question. No.
No, there is currently no way for anyone in that business to register with either the SEC or the CFTC. In FIT 21, the bill that we're considering in the Rules Committee today, do we or do we not create an opportunity and in fact a requirement for those registries to take place?
Yes, we do, Gentlewoman. This bill has strict registration requirements, capital requirements, custody requirements, dealer requirements, broker requirements for anyone dealing in a digital security or a digital commodity. They're strictly overseen if they're registered as a security by the SEC and if a commodity, then by the CFTC. And they will jointly write the rules to make sure they're done in a timely, coordinated way. And just like our committees have worked together seamlessly in designing this legislation, we know that Chairman Benham at the CFTC and the SEC are prepared to work together to do this.
So in addition to that, let's talk briefly about some of the regulators who over the course of the last few years have asked Congress to create a bill such as FIT 21. I'll go to CFTC Chairman Benham, Treasury Secretary Yellen, the Financial Stability Oversight Committee. Even Chair Gensler said that in 2021 that there need to be more investor protections for digital asset trading platforms and asked Congress to consider this issue. In 2022, FSOC issued a report on digital assets recommending Congress pass legislation to provide explicit authority for financial federal regulators over spot market crypto assets that are not securities. Chair Benham also frequently and publicly has called for additional legislation to close this, quote, spot market gap and provide CFTC, not SEC, with the authority to register and regulate commodity digital trading platforms. Mr. Chairman, Chairman Hill, is that what we're doing in the FIT 21 Act?
It is, quite specifically. As I say, this is responsive to President Biden's executive order on digital assets that identified that there were regulatory gaps in the market structure for digital assets. This bill directly relates to that. And they also, in the FSOC report, said that there needed to be CFTC oversight of spot markets for Bitcoin. And finally, I would say something we haven't talked about today is that they also, in that Biden executive order, called for a legislated solution on payment stablecoins, which would advance the American leadership in tokenized payments, which we really haven't talked about today, but Mrs. Waters and Mr. McHenry have been leaders in designing a dollar-based payment stablecoin that could be used as a part of this market structure. And that's why I believe that our two committees, on a bipartisan basis, have designed legislation that's directly responsive to concerns expressed by regulators and expressed by market participants.
Will the gentle lady yield?
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Hill, for mentioning stablecoins. Mr. McHenry and I worked for 2 years to put together a stablecoin bill, and I think we could have gotten one, but for some resistance, I understand, from the opposite side of the aisle. I think we should have pursued that. I think we could have gotten to it, but instead, here we come up with market structure, which is so different. We needed to get started with crypto. Stablecoin would have been the way to do it. I wanted that very much. This bill is totally different. This is not even the same bill that we had in committee. And I want to tell you, while you talk about the fact that, the SEC and commodities regulations could be determined in this bill. Some would be securities, some would be commodities, et cetera, et cetera. The trick is you give the SEC 60 days to determine whether 16,000 crypto companies should be under securities or commodities, et cetera. So that means that it can't happen. It really is not going to happen. What we should do is we should not be in this area where we're trying to answer to the commodities, to the crypto industry. They want not to have the guardrails of the securities. In this bill, there is no way that CFTC would have the kind of authority that the SEC has now. No way. They don't have those kind of guardrails. And so it is a mistake for us to allow the industry to have the kind of influence where they can come up with a bill even more detrimental than the first bill that we had in committee, take away the guardrails, give the SEC very limited time to determine whether or not, the crypto companies are going to be SEC regulated or whether or not it's going to be CFTC. This is not the kind of work that will protect our investors. This is not the kind of work that will have the power of the SEC. This is not going to an agency that has the size and the employees by which to do this work. And so I think we should not fold and roll over for the crypto industry, who has so much power and influence, exercising it at the last minute in our Congress of the United States of America. I think we should move forward with making sure that we have everything that we need in order to deal with the crypto industry, stop the fraud, stop the theft, stop the fentanyl support and all that they're doing. So I thank you for your time.
Mr. Hill, Chairman Hill, if we do nothing, are we protecting investors from fraud? If we do not pass FIT 21, are we protecting investors from fraud, particularly in the spot market commodities sector and digital assets?
I'm going to yield some time to Mr. Johnson to answer the question as well, but I would say no. We have a weaker regulatory environment for consumers. They don't have the protections that they would have under this bill because of the disclosure and registration and capital requirements and commingling and custody rules. They're quite clear. They're quite geared towards consumer protection, and they are patterned on the existing consumer protections that we have in the regular securities market today. And innovators, people who want to try to bring a blockchain innovation to the market also are going to continue to do that work outside the United States if we don't have the clarity for innovators and investors. That's why I believe this bill has both components that are important. But let me ask Mr. Johnson to address the commodity piece.
This allegation that somehow the CFTC doesn't have the size and scope necessary to handle a new regulatory function, we have heard this before. Some alleged it during the Dodd-Frank passage. That was when the CFTC was provided oversight over swaps. They handled that new regulatory, and I might add, massive new regulatory function with great aplomb. Nobody would propose stripping that out of the CFTC today. And of course, they already, Here's the amazing thing. The CFTC already has the spot market jurisdiction with regard to fraud and manipulation, but it comes at a point that is too late to protect consumers. And so what we can do is provide them the additional tools that this bill does to protect consumers by implementing appropriate transparency and other regulatory tools that can make sure fewer consumers are hurt. Remember, the FTX debacle happened under the regulatory regime that some of these panelists are so much in love with.
Question, should the SEC, to Mr. Johnson, should the SEC regulate commodities?
To my knowledge, the SEC has never regulated commodities. And I am, in 18 months of hearing from experts on both sides of the aisle before our committee, not one of them, to my recollection, suggested that the SEC should regulate commodities.
And should the CFTC regulate securities?
No.
So thank you for that. One other point I want to make is that under the current regime, Secretary or Chairman Gensler is really doing what we have seen as regulation by enforcement from the SEC. This is to Chairman Hill. Regulation by enforcement is putting developers of digital assets and service providers in an impossible spot of just trying to guess what activities the regulator will decide runs afoul of the law. So under the current regulatory framework, how can digital asset developers innovate if they don't know what the rules will be? And is it mind reading? Is it reading the press reports? How do they know if they're going to be violating the law under the current regime from Secretary Gensler, Chairman Gensler?
It's such a good question, and it's really at the heart of FIT 21 is to try to bring clarity to that in addition to the consumer protection focus and the balance between the securities markets and the commodity markets. And let's just look at the confusion out there. I mentioned the Ripple case, the XRP case that went through the Southern District in New York, where the court actually ruled in sort of a backwards manner. It suggested that institutional investors should be protected and retail investors deserve no protection. Well, clearly that's not the traditions behind our 90 years of securities laws and consumer protection. In the case of the statement that the ranking member has made a couple of times tonight, that, look, people just need to come in and register. I hear that consistently. Well, the answer to that question is, ranking member, they have. And they don't get any answers from the SEC. They get no clarity from the SEC. They get no exemptive relief from the SEC. And I'll say under Chairman Clayton or Chairman Gensler, I mean, it's been a confusing period for several years for them. And to make it more, put a point on it, think about this. One of the largest digital asset exchanges in the country is a publicly traded company called Coinbase. That company went to the SEC and filed an S-1, which is a registration statement to go public. And the SEC gets to ask you all the questions in the world about your business strategy, what you're doing, who the investors are, who the owners are, and they approved it. And Coinbase went public. And yet they've been under constant scrutiny by the SEC, despite their best efforts time and time again to go in and register. So I believe part of this bill is to bring clarity to that registration. So in this bill, if you are in the commodity space or the security space, if this bill is enacted into law, you'll be deemed automatically registered and subject to the oversight of the SEC and the CFTC day one. And you'll have to work through that process as these two agencies write the rules. But I think clarity is the name of the game if we want to have our reputation for a worldwide technology leader. And I yield back to the gentlelady.
A couple of things to wrap up here. Ms. Scanlon had asked two questions. Why the new regulatory structure and how do we help constituents from being defrauded? I would say the answers to those two questions is, first, it's not really a new regulatory structure, but because there currently is no regime to regulate or to register spot market commodities with the CFTC, and those do exist digitally. And second, I would say to answer your question, how do we help them? We pass FIT 21. With that, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. The gentlelady yields back. Chair now is pleased to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to be brief, but I do have a couple of questions, and I lean towards what Congressman Norman said earlier towards kind of the caveat emptor, buyer beware. This is a dangerous thing that you're playing with, and not sure that it can be regulated in such a manner that provides any consumer protections. So I would also tell you that what Gary Gensler is doing, regulation by enforcement is not acceptable. I mean, he's picking and choosing who he wants to fine, and I don't think that Chairman Beanham would operate that way. I think he's a good regulator and has a good reputation. My question, and Dusty, you know this, Congressman Johnson, because of our discussions about it, is the number of coins that exist out there. And their numbers, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, however many coins there are. Congressman Waters, I heard you say 16,000. It's clearly in the tens of thousands, though. So I'm going to pick one. And I'm going to pick Dogecoin. It's a meme coin. Started out as a joke. Didn't intend to be anything. It reached a high value of $85 billion, I believe. And I think it currently sits around $23 billion. Right now, you've got ChatGPT and other AI platforms picking and choosing and making predictions on which meme stock is going, or meme coin, I should say, is going to perform the best. And I'm sure people are betting on those. But Dogecoin, is this really something that should be registered or regulated when it started out as a joke?
I mean, our system of market regulation, sir, doesn't have government determine the merit of a product.
That's right.
And if you're, listen, I'll move now more to the state and local enforcement arena, but if you're going to go, if you are defrauded because you purchased worthless items like fidget spinners or Beanie Babies, you don't forfeit your ability to be protected under the American jurisprudence system. And similarly, when you're dealing with non-security commodities, well, I shouldn't say non-security commodities. When you're dealing with securities, we're clearly going to have a cop on the beat. That cop on the beat for securities has been, and under this bill would continue to be, the SEC.
But a meme coin would fall under the CFTC, I believe. Is that correct, Mr. Hill?
Go ahead and answer.
Well, to be considered I mean, you're in essence, it's assumed you're a security unless you can pass the 5-pronged decentralization test. And although I'm not an expert on Dogecoin, I would tell you I don't think that's an easy test to pass. And unless, to my knowledge, no one in Dogecoin has ever asserted that they passed the 5-pronged decentralized test, in which case the CFTC would not be the regulator for that.
I guess my point there, before I go to Mr. Hill, is that this started as a joke. It was a meme coin. There are other meme coins that are being created now, and now it's got a value of $23 billion with absolutely nothing other than, there's nothing to back it up. So people have to, I almost wonder that, I don't necessarily disagree with what you're doing, other than I think it may lend more credibility to the actual meme coin. Mr. Hill?
Well, let me use a securities example. Stocks that have no market cap, very limited shares outstanding,
Yep.
no real business plan, or traded over the counter in what used to be called the pink sheets.
That's right.
They're called penny stocks. Does that mean the whole stock market is not worthy of regulation, oversight, and participation? The answer is no. Those penny stocks have no constituency. They sit out there. They, I guess, are complying at a minimal standard with the bulletin board SEC rules for an over-the-counter security to barely be functional. And this would be true on any number of publicly traded companies that might be junior mining stocks in a thinly traded jurisdiction of the 190th largest country in the United Nations. I mean, that might be a public company, but it's not one that you might seek investment in. So I think you'll find that this regulatory structure under FIT 21 will do the opposite of what you're saying, which is demand higher quality, people raising standards And something like Dogecoin would be defunct and would be cast off as not a good or sound potential investment. And I think you make a very good point, but it is a buyer beware, disclosure-based marketplace we're in. And just as I wouldn't buy a junior mining stock in a tiny country with no market cap and no market coverage and no transparency to financial statements, I don't recommend someone consider Dogecoin.
It reached a value of $85 billion, and
I understand that.
worth $23 billion.
There's speculation in this
Be a pretty
market.
good-sized mining company.
I understand. It's probably many times valued, all the mining companies in combination perhaps, but speculation is in all our markets, with or without regulation. You've made that point. Mr. Norman's made that point. In my view, this bill provides more disclosure, more regulatory certainty, and more clarity for innovators, investors, and the consuming public.
Will the
I
gentleman
agree. I
yield?
agree with you on that, Mr. Hill. I do agree with you on that. I have. My concern is whether or not it can actually be with the total volume of them out there, whether or not it can actually be done.
Will
Ma'am.
the gentleman yield?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much, and I agree with you. And I just want to point out that my friend, Mr. Hill, keeps talking about all of the guardrails that are developed in this bill that are not evident, I guess, in the SEC, and how it will do better for investors and consumers. I disagree with that. For example, just one little example. Once the digital assets move to the CFTC, all disclosure stops within 180 days, and the CFTC has no authority under this bill to require ongoing disclosures. And so what has to be looked at is, what authorities does the SEC have? And how is that matched up in this bill with the CFTC? Do they eliminate? Do they not mention? Do they point them out? Is it identified in the bill that they have authorities that they keep talking about? I don't think so. I yield back.
So, ma'am, I think Chairman Beanham is a pretty good regulator that's not an activist. I think Mr. Gensler is an activist in a regulatory position, and so that's where I don't blame them for wanting to be regulated under the CFTC. I think CFTC's more professional than some of the political things that are going on.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yeah, I'll yield to Mr. Johnson, and then we'll move on.
I would just note that the CFTC does require disclosures for exchanges. They are breathtaking in size and scope. They are well documented in the Federal Register and in court cases. They would absolutely, those exchanges would absolutely have to make disclosures.
I respect the CFTC as a professional organization, and Mr. Beanham's appointed by Democrats, but I respect them as a professional organization. I'll yield the remainder of my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As has been pointed out today, in the absence of digital asset market framework here in the U.S., other countries have filled the void. Representative Hill, Representative Johnson, could you reiterate for us today how has the absence of a regulatory framework in the U.S. compared to other G7 nations, and what impact has this absence of a framework had on the innovation flight?
I'm happy to start and then yield to Mr. Johnson. I think other jurisdictions, Singapore stands out, the United Kingdom, the City of London stand out particularly as two jurisdictions that are seeking digital assets as a business strategy because they recognize that Web3 and writing applications on a blockchain could be a real fast growth area for sales, trading, and investing in their marketplaces. And obviously, both the United Kingdom and Singapore are known for rule of law and known for very good regulatory regimes. So we're stepping behind that. There are other places that are attempting to do it. I'm purposely not naming them, but many other countries are trying to get into this game. We're the world's largest economy. We're the world's most established financial market. We have the rule of law here. We have the judicial system that's trusted for adjudicating complaints around the world. We have outstanding AML, BSA, and financial market regulation. So I believe that if we put FIT 21 in place today, we'll see more money come back to the United States in this space, and that our base regulatory structure will be emulated around the world as the best structure for either a digital security asset or a digital commodity asset. And I yield to my friend, Mr. Johnson.
No, you said it perfectly.
I yield back to the gentleman from New York.
Thank you. And I understand that the People's Republic of China banned crypto years ago and seems to now be pivoting back slowly. Recent reports have suggested that Beijing is preparing to possibly lift its ban on crypto with a cautious first step. If China were to find a path towards playing a bigger role in digital assets, what impact could this have on the U.S., particularly without a solid regulatory framework like the one under FIT 21?
The United States has most every advantage you can imagine in our competition against China, right? We've got a free market, they've got centralized planning. We know that doesn't work. We've got an open society, they don't. And yet, on the Select Committee on China, of which I'm proud to be a member, in 31 of the most cutting-edge emerging technology areas, China has a lead in 27 of the 31. And I think that is problematic. In this particular area, we know that capital flows to areas where they have predictability. And again, we're going to beat China provided that we have a predictability that comes with a regulatory framework that is accepted and is common sense. FIT 21 establishes that kind of framework.
Anything you'd like to add to that, Mr. Hill?
Well, just this point that I've mentioned a couple of times today, that when you combine this competitive regulatory framework, the best on the globe, given our size of market, rule of law, and you combine that with, I think, a successful approach, I'm more optimistic than my friend from California, that Mrs. Waters and Mr. McHenry will find a good spot on a payment stablecoin legislation. That is a digital token payment to be used on a blockchain that's backed by bank deposits or 90-day treasury bills or something equally sound, and that will, in my view, make America even more competitive as it relates to the reserve currency, because you'll see people use the payment stablecoin that's dollar-backed as a part of both commercial and consumer transactions in and outside the United States. Yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you. It is great to see this legislation brought forward today that supports continued U.S. leadership in digital assets, that protects this growing and innovative sector from bad actors, and ends a regulatory turf war that has for years jeopardized sound, innovative growth. Regarding the Cbdc Anti-Surveillance State Act, as a co-sponsor of this legislation, I strongly support prohibiting the Federal Reserve from pursuing a path that jeopardizes the privacy rights of American citizens. We have far too many infringements on American citizens' privacy. Representative Hill, we often associate central bank digital currencies with authoritarian regimes. However, we've recently seen Western governments like Canada use their power to shut down political protesters' access to their own bank accounts. Given the lessons that we're seeing from other nations that push for a central bank digital currency early or repressed freedoms of individuals, can you remind us why this legislation is just so important?
Well, the concern is it permissionless, and is it treated like cash, and does it provide that kind of independent capability of an American citizen like we have now? So my view is that a retail-based CBDC limits people's privacy, and that's a real risk. It's not permissionless, and it could be used for government control. I'm not arguing that it would be, but I'm arguing it could be, and that's why I think Congress should prohibit this without strict authority by the Article I branch of government, the Congress. And I would add one comment about the developed world. You referenced large economies. Last summer, I met with the team of people working at the Bank of England in London who have done the research and the analytic work on a CBDC for the pound. And that's, as you know, a nation of about 40 million people, our great ally, the United Kingdom. But when they published in their equivalent of the Federal Register this idea of what they might do, they got 50,000 comment letters. in a society of 40 million. I thought that was quite large, mostly in opposition. They too share the concern about permissionless. They share about the privacy concerns there. So as I say, there may be well over 100 countries doing it, but I don't see over 100 countries studying it, I should say, but I don't see countries actually implementing it for the concerns that we're expressing today before this panel. I yield back to
Will the gentleman yield?
Certainly.
Thank you very much. 170 countries. My concern is, why should we close off any discussion? Why should we stop the Fed from doing the analyzing and the investigation when all of the other countries of the world are basically moving forward? I am not saying that once this work is done, that somehow we know what the answers are going to be, that it's already been decided. What I'm saying is we are more innovative, we are more creative, we are more futuristic than to have a ban on even a pilot program that's being done by your central bank. It just doesn't make good sense for the legislative arm of the United States of America to start to stop the central bank from exploring and trying to determine what and how we are going to do it. That's all. And I yield back.
Thank you very much. I think, I really appreciate, your insight and the testimony here from Representative Johnson, Representative Hill, and I couldn't agree with French Hill anymore. I think it's always been an absurd idea to think that certain rights and freedoms would be under threat until they actually are. And Americans are sick and tired of being spied on. And under President Biden, the American people are left wondering if they'll be able to purchase a gas stove or if they can do what they wish with their own private land because there happens to be a tiny stream running through it. We cannot take for granted our rights as American citizens, especially when you have an administration that has weaponized our federal agencies against the freedoms of individuals, as this one has for the last 4 years. So I strongly support the legislation before us today, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, and gentlemen. Gentleman yields back. Seeing no other members wishing to ask questions, I do have one observation. Since it's been brought up twice, that the Consumer CFTC Modernization Act passed in 2000. That was a bill that was signed into law by Bill Clinton, a Democratic president. There are only 2 members present today who actually voted in that floor vote. Ms. Waters actually was not recorded. Mr. McGovern voted aye. It was 292 to 60. 133 Republicans voted aye. 157 Democrats voted aye. So it was clearly a true bipartisan split on that. But I do want to thank you for your testimony today. Our witnesses are excused.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hard pass. Thank you.
And as quickly as we can, I want to call up our second panel. Representative Andy Biggs and Ranking Member Jamie Raskin from the Committee of Oversight and Accountability. Are you okay if we get started? And we'll allow Mr. Raskin to join in progress, but Mr. Biggs, I welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And
I do ask the committee be in order and welcome Mr. Raskin.
And members of the committee, I urge the Rules Committee to grant a prompt rule for the House's consideration of H.R. 192, an act to prohibit individuals who are not citizens of the United States from voting in elections in the District of Columbia. In reporting out H.R. 192, the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability holds that Congress must act to exert its constitutional responsibility to oversee the District of Columbia and make certain necessary amendments to the district's law. Since the voters entrusted Republicans with control of the House in 1/18, the Oversight Committee has conducted long overdue oversight of our nation's capital city, including holding hearings on the District of Columbia. Specifically to the topic we're discussing today, the Oversight Committee held a joint hearing with the Committee on House Administration on election integrity in the district. At that hearing, both committees examined the district government's Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act, allowing non-citizen residents to vote in D.C. local elections. This act includes illegal immigrants and even foreign diplomats whose interests may be opposed to the interests of Americans, and as others pointed out, even visiting students. This radical change to our election laws upsets lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. D.C. Mayor Bowser withheld her signature on the act, something she has done only a handful of times. On February 9th, 2023, 260 members in the House voted to overturn the D.C. Act through a resolution of disapproval. In that vote, 42 House Democrats voted to block this D.C. law. However, the bipartisan resolution of disapproval was not considered in the Senate, so D.C.'s non-citizen voting law went into effect. This is unacceptable. The primary factor that differentiates American citizens from non-citizens is the right to vote. D.C. residents should be confident that their local government vote is not being diluted by lawful non-citizen residents or illegal immigrants. Article 1 of the Constitution grants Congress exclusive jurisdiction over the nation's capital, and rules of the U.S. House charge the Committee on Oversight Committee and Accountability with the duty to oversee the municipal affairs of the District of Columbia. I urge my colleagues to support Representative Pfluger's common sense bill to ensure that only U.S. citizens have the right to vote in local D.C. elections and repeal D.C.'s radical law. Since 1973's Limited Home Rule Act, 4 times the D.C. legislature has been nullified, and 7 times disapproval resolutions have received floor consideration in at least one House. I thank the Rules Committee for convening today to discuss this bill, and I look forward to the conversation. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. The Rules Committee is always happy to convene for you, and Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Chairman Burgess. Well, this one's a rerun. You'll recall we've basically discussed the merits of this in depth back when the D.C. Council first passed their Local Residents Voting Rights Amendments Act back in January. The House passed a disapproval resolution in February of last year. The Senate did not agree with the disapproval resolution, and the act became law on March 10th, 2023. The people in D.C. are actually in the middle of their primary election. They've already sent out their ballots, and the city's been receiving ballots in that election under this law, which survived the review process. Look, this is really making a mountain out of a molehill. There are 512 permanent resident green card holders or other non-citizens registered in D.C., which is less than 1/10 or a little bit over 1/10 of 1% of all the resident voters in their city. That's 454,739 registered voters. And so this is 1/10 of 1% of them. And as I said, the election already started. I think last time I canvassed the long and interesting history of non-citizen voting in America. When the country started, non-citizens could vote in most states, the basic logic of it was if you were a property-owning white male, it didn't make any difference what your citizenship status was, and that was the basic logic for voting for a very long time. It became a bone of contention between the North and the South before the Civil War. There was a big fight about it during the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Southern states opposed alien suffrage, not so much on principled grounds, but because they said that the immigrants coming in were anti-slavery. Lincoln and the Republican Party were steadfast champions of non-citizen voting. When the secession happened, the Confederates wrote into the Confederate Constitution in Article 1 that non-citizens will not be allowed to vote in the Confederacy. Then after the North won the Civil War, then non-citizen voting, what Lincoln and his party called declarant alien suffrage, people who were on the pathway to citizenship, that policy spread across the country, which is why most states, including most or maybe even all of the states represented by members on this distinguished committee, have had non-citizen voting at one point or another. In any event, all of that is kind of irrelevant because what's happened in D.C. is local elections. It's for voting for their D.C. council, the mayor, their school board elections, and the advisory neighborhood commissions. There's no federal interest there at all. I mean, of course, they don't have voting representation in the Senate or the House. They have a non-voting delegate in the House, but the non-citizens cannot vote for the non-voting delegate. They can only vote for the local elections like the school board and the city council. So I don't see why this is a federal issue. I can see why some might, like it to be a political issue, but it's really just a matter of home rule. And so we say, let the people of D.C. with their very slender, modest apportionment of democratic rights decide who they want to allow to vote in their local elections. And with that, happy to yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Gentleman yields back. Mr. Biggs, let me just ask you, I think you referenced in your comments that a diplomat, that would be a citizen of a foreign country who is residing in D.C. doing their diplomatic work, would be eligible to vote in the D.C. election. Did I understand you correctly?
Yes, sir. It would. Even the Washington Post agrees with that assessment, and so noted, which is why the Washington Post opposed the D.C. Act.
So there'd be no requirement that there'd be a non-adversarial diplomat. An adversarial diplomat could vote just the same as a friendly diplomat.
Yes, sir, that's correct. And that's why what makes D.C. a little bit more pernicious than some of the others is Maryland has certain restrictions, California has restrictions on non-residents, non-citizens who are voting, who are residents, but D.C. does not.
Well, just the D.C. law says that you cannot be voting in any other country. So if somebody were voting in another country, they would not be allowed to vote in the Advisory Neighborhood Commission elections in D.C. or for the D.C. Council.
If I may respond to that, that's interesting because some nations that are authoritarian in nature, you would question, for instance, whether they're actually voting in another jurisdiction, and how are we going to monitor that?
Well, that was going to be my,
well,
how do you monitor that?
If you read the D.C. law, what it says is that you can't be voting in another country, and this is punishable by 5 years in prison for fraud. So, I mean, if it meant that much to you, I suppose you could be voting in Russia or China and then sign up to vote in the D.C. school board elections. But if you did and you were found out, you could be, prosecuted and sent to jail for 5 years. And so I doubt that any of those 512 people who signed up are agents of foreign governments. In any event, federally and across the country, people who are registered foreign agents under FARA can vote. And people who've been convicted of offenses involving foreign agents like Michael Flynn or Paul Manafort, they still vote. And maybe we should reconsider that. But, I mean, that strikes me as a bigger threat and something we could do something about in elections that mean something to the country.
Well, it means, if I may, it does, that means 512 people have their votes canceled out, perhaps, at least theoretically. So it should mean something to the voters of the city, should it not?
Mr. Chairman, I think it does. I think it says something about the integrity of the entire election and the foundation of it. But more so, the argument would be made and could be made that there's dilution of your vote. Now, 512, if that's the actual number, that's not much dilution, which is what the court actually held here in D.C. But the reality is, I'm not sure we're sure. I mean, I'm looking at the postcard that was sent out by the Elections Commission here in D.C. Just, if you want to register to vote, you just do the QR code. And so that makes it very interesting on who's registering to vote as well, Mr. Chairman.
Was the gentleman asking
Yes,
consent to make that part of the record?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I am, as well as a letter dated May 6, 2024 by Chairman Stott.
Without objections ordered, the gentleman.
Well, Mr. Chair, we just spent 2.5 hours on the previous bills, which are going to go to the Senate and die. What we're voting on today, which I think undermines the democratic self-governance of our nation's capital, which has already been disenfranchised by members of this body already, is going to go to the Senate, and if it goes to the Senate, we'll join the other bills and just die. I don't have any questions. I mean, this is a waste of time. We've essentially already voted on the bill that has the effect of this bill before. This is not the first time we've done this. And so this is a repeat performance. And again, it's a total waste of time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
You know, thank you for doing it. This is not a waste of time. The fact we even have to bring this to a vote, let's put people on record. You vote against, you vote for you vote to let illegals vote in D.C. It's laughable we're having to do it. And what you show, what you put in as exhibit tells it all. It's anti-democracy, anti-constitution. No questions. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you. I find it interesting that we're putting QR codes into the record as opposed to maybe the bill, because the conversation thus far has indicated that people have not read the underlying bill. They don't understand that it requires people to prove residency for at least 30 days. They don't understand that there are the provisions saying they can't vote elsewhere, et cetera. So I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Mr. Raskin, or have we rehashed this ad nauseum?
No, I think you're right. Look, they've got the procedural safeguards they want for their local election. I think from our standpoint, I mean, you know, even if you take the position that, you know, so much of American history was just wrong and Lincoln was wrong and the Republican Party was wrong when it defended this, fine. But this is just about local elections. It's about voting for school board and city council. And so I think there are very strong philosophical and political objections about allowing people to vote in two countries. I mean, if you're voting in U.S. and in Canada, then the nation's interests could conflict. But if you're just talking about local elections, that's about efficient garbage collection and good schools where presumably, you know, the nation state of your birth might not be relevant, which is why hundreds of localities across the country over the course of American history have allowed people to vote regardless of their citizenship. And that might not be right for every city or town, but obviously the people in D.C. want it.
Well, and of course, these people are paying taxes in D.C., paying school taxes, paying other taxes. Their votes in these local elections can then impact how those taxes are spent. All 512 of them, you said, out of over 454?
That's how many the Board of Elections says are registered now, yes.
Okay, thank you.
0.1% of the total.
I appreciate your
People
testimony. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I actually have just a document that I want to, I'm sorry.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I don't have any questions, Mr. Chairman. I would just tell you that if you want to vote inside the United States of America, you should be a citizen of the United States of America. There's a naturalization process if you've legally immigrated, and it's just common sense to me. With that, I yield.
Did the gentleman from Georgia want to recognize the gentleman from Arizona for unanimous consent request?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I have an article in the Washington Post, an opinion piece on this that says we oppose the bill because there's an estimated 50,000 non-citizen residents who could conceivably cast ballots in local elections.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman yields back.
Gentleman yields.
Gentlelady from New Mexico's.
Here we are again. I think there's been good explanation of why we let local entities make decisions about local potholes. And given that it's 512 voters, I think we've spent more than that words, and so I shall yield back.
Chair, thanks, the gentlelady.
I'm sorry, Representative Raskin, before I yield, it sounded like you wanted
Oh,
to say
I was
something.
just going to say, federal law, of course, bans non-citizens from voting in federal elections, so we've taken care of that.
Constitution, federal law, that's already done. We should not be, this has nothing to do with federal law or federal elections or even statewide elections, so it's about potholes.
Does the gentlelady yield back? Yes. Chair, thanks, the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Seeing no further questions for this panel, the witnesses are excused.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And then I would like to invite members who wish to offer amendments. Mr. Self, why don't you sit here in the center so we can all see you better? I don't know that we have a big panel. So we're going to recognize our panel in order of seniority. Mr. Self, you're recognized to speak on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment on H.R. 5403. I would like to add Section 7, a sense of the Congress. And it does not seek to change the bill. I want to add a sense of Congress that a central bank digital currency would lead to a potentially unlimited amount of unwarranted surveillance on millions of Americans. I think you've already covered a lot of this in your discussion on the FIT 21 bill, but I want to emphasize the fact that this may be the final nail in the surveillance state, because financial records, financial visibility, financial transparency to the government may be the final nail in the surveillance state, because that's where they see everything, and they can use that to monitor and to guide what you spend it on. I think that unprecedented visibility into every transaction is dangerous for our republic. And I think that the privacy violations, to use that term, underestimates the danger here. When the tracking can reveal your spending patterns, your preferences, your political associations, your social affiliations, based on your financial transactions, and that is exactly what is possible. That leads itself to misuse for political or financial gain. And I will tell you the historical examples of overreach and abuse of surveillance powers we have already debated in this Congress in the FISA reauthorization. And frankly, I think part of this would deter individuals from doing what they want to do. Knowing their privacy would be violated, I think it would be a measure of deterrence for what people actually would like to do. I think that China, with their social credit system, is the example we ought to be looking at. Because, and I think Mr. Roy earlier said, if you buy a gas guzzler over an EV, if you buy a weapon, if you buy anything, then they can use that against you. So this is a very simple this is a very simple amendment. Again, I do not want to change this bill. I simply want to add an amendment that emphasizes the fact that we will have potentially unlimited amounts of privacy violations into the financial transactions. And I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. You've stated the issue very well. I have no questions. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
I thank the gentleman for being here. I have no idea whether your amendment will be made in order or not. It's up to them, because they have 9 and we only have 4. But if it's not made in order, I hope you won't vote for the rule that will block your own amendment. But with that, I yield back.
The gentleman from South Carolina. The gentleman has no questions. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania. The gentlelady has no questions. The gentlelady from Indiana has no questions. The gentlelady from New Mexico has no questions.
I want to point this out because I do think it's important. I used to be regulated by FINRA. FINRA has now recommended that your broker-dealer see your personal bank statements, not your business bank statements, but your personal bank statements. It's an extreme overreach from an agency that we as Congress have no oversight over, and I think we need to be very careful of all of these privacy concerns. So I'm good with the amendment. You want to go ahead? I'll yield to the gentleman.
Will the gentleman yield? Thank you.
Sure.
I'll make one more point. We all put in a financial disclosure form. Think of that into your personal bank accounts of every single American, and I yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
Absolutely. How much did you give to the church? How much did you spend at the liquor store? You know.
We'll leave that as an open question. Does the gentlelady from Minnesota have a question? Gentlelady has no questions. I want to thank you for coming to the Rules Committee. You may well be invited back sometime. The witness is excused. Is there anyone else seeking to testify on H.R. 5403, H.R. 4763, for H.R. 192? Seeing none, this closes the hearing portion. The chair will be in receipt of a motion from the gentlewoman from Indiana, Ms. Houchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 4763, the Financial Innovation and Technology for the 21st Century Act, a structured rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services or their respective designees. The rule provides that in lieu of the amendments in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committees on Agriculture and Financial Services now printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of the substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 118-33, modified by the amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only those amended printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report. Each amendment made in order may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. All points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report are waived. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 5403, the Cbdc Anti-Surveillance State Act, under a structured rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate. Equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services or their respective designees. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Financial Services now printed in the bill shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only those amendments printed in Part C of the Rules Committee report. Each amendment made in order may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, and shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. All points of order against the amendments printed in Part C of the Rules Committee report are waived. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 192 to prohibit individuals who are not citizens of the United States from voting in elections in the District of Columbia under a closed rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Oversight and Accountability now printed in the bill shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Oversight and Accountability or their respective designees. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit.
Thank you very much. You've heard the motion. Is there any discussion or amendment to the rule?
Mr. Chairman? Yeah,
Gentleman from
yeah,
Massachusetts.
I don't see Mr. Self's amendment made in order.
Yes, it is.
Is that the one that he testified on? I see he's a co-sponsor of one. Is that what he testified?
Yes.
Okay. And I would just also know for the record that a number of on-time Democratic amendments were not made in order, but I noticed that Mr. Norman and Mr. Perry have late amendments here, and they were made in order. I just point that out for the record that, again, we should strive for more balance and fairness here. But with that, we only have one motion. I'll yield to
Gentleman, he's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order amendments number 13, 14, and 15 to H.R. 4763, each offered by Representative Caston. As we discussed earlier in the meeting, there are numerous Democrat amendments intended to provide additional guardrails to make sure that the public was aware of some of the risks with regards to digital asset mixers, and in order to ensure that there was that we limited potential for fraud. These amendments would address some of those issues, and I urge a yes vote on my motion.
You've heard the amendment. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing none, the question is on the amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no.
No.
The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. A roll call vote has been requested. The clerk will call roll.
Mr. Reschenthaler? No. Mr. Reschenthaler? No. Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mr. Massey? Mr. Norman? No. Mr. Norman? No. Mr. Roy? No. Mr. Roy? No. Mrs. Houchin? No. Mrs. Houchin? No. Mr. Langworthy? No. Mr. Langworthy? No. Mr. Scott? No. Mr. Scott? No. Mr. McGovern? Aye. Mr. McGovern? Aye. Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Mr. Neguse? Ms. Ledger Fernandez? Aye. Ms. Ledger Fernandez? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
Chair votes no.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk will report.
3 yeas, 8 nays.
And the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Is there further amendment or discussion? If not, the question is on the motion from the gentleman from Indiana. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is
We
agreed
ask for a
to.
roll call.
Roll call vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Massey? Mr. Norman? Aye. Mr. Norman? Aye. Mr. Roy? Aye. Mr. Roy? Aye. Mrs. Houchin? Aye. Mrs. Houchin? Aye. Mr. Langworthy? Aye. Mr. Langworthy? Aye. Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. McGovern?
No.
Mr. McGovern? No. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Neguse? Ms. Ledger Fernandez? No. Ms. Ledger Fernandez? No. Mr. Chairman?
Chair votes aye.
Mr. Chairman? Aye.
Clerk will report.
8 yeas, 3 nays.
And the ayes have it. The motion to report is agreed to. Accordingly, Ms. Houchin will be managing for the majority.
Oh,
I'll yield to-
and I'm going to do it for the minority. And I also want to point out for the record, self-amendment number 5 was not made in order, we're told. So I ask that.
We'll discuss it later, but I believe it was.
No, you didn't. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
It makes,